Section 1. The origin story nobody fully knows. There is a moment somewhere in the mid-1990s at the Rhode Island School of Design where a young animation student sat down, picked up a pencil, and started sketching out a fat, dim-witted man and his dog. He had no idea, genuinely, absolutely no idea, that what he was drawing would eventually become one of the most watched animated shows in the history of American television. The man drawing was Seth MacFarlane, and the characters he was sketching were the earliest ancestors of Peter and Brian Griffin. But here is where things get interesting, because most people who know the origin story of Family Guy think it starts with a pitch, a meeting, a handshake. They think Seth MacFarlane walked into a Fox executive's office with a cartoon already formed in his head and sold them on it. That is not really how it happened. The truth is messier, more accidental, and considerably more interesting than the polished version most people have heard. Let us start at the very beginning. Seth Woodbury MacFarlane was born on the 26th of October, 1973, in Kent, Connecticut. He grew up in a house where Broadway musicals played on the stereo and old Hollywood movies flickered on the television. His parents gave him a home movie camera when he was still a young child, and he started making his own short films almost immediately. He drew his own comic strips, he animated things. He was clearly, from an early age, someone for whom storytelling was not a hobby, it was just how his brain worked. When it came time for college, MacFarlane chose the Rhode Island School of Design in Providence. RISD, as it is known, is one of the most respected art schools in the United States. It is not a film school in the conventional sense. It is a place where people go to learn visual art in a very deliberate, technical, hands-on way. The atmosphere there was rigorous and demanding, and it pushed MacFarlane to be precise about what he was creating. He earned a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Animation, which sounds like a straightforward path to where he ended up, but the real education happened in the corners and margins of his time there. During his senior year at RISD, MacFarlane created his thesis film. It was called The Life of Larry. Now, this is something that most Family Guy fans have heard of in a general sense, but very few have actually watched it, and the details of what is in that short film are genuinely remarkable once you know what to look for. The Life of Larry runs about 11 minutes. It stars a middle-aged, balding, overweight man named Larry Cummings, his wife Lois, his overweight teenage son named Milt, and a cynical talking dog named Steve. Larry is dim-witted and lovable. Steve is the voice of reason. The house they live in, the rhythm of their interactions, the way the cutaway gags interrupt the main story, all of it is essentially a rougher, cruder preview of what would become Family Guy 4 years later. There are even specific jokes in The Life of Larry that would later be recycled almost verbatim into the early episodes of Family Guy. A gag about Peter farting for the first time at age 30 appeared in The Life of Larry first, and then showed up again in the Family Guy pilot episode, Death Has a Shadow. A Star Trek parody that MacFarlane did in the short film resurfaced in the very early episodes of the show as well. An England-based joke that appears in the short was later used in the Season 1 episode, There's Something About Polly. The Life of Larry was not just an inspiration. In several specific traceable ways, it was a first draft. What makes the story even more remarkable is what happened with that thesis film after MacFarlane handed it in. His RISD professor, rather than simply grading it and filing it away like most student films, submitted it to Hanna-Barbera. For those who are not familiar with the history of animation, Hanna-Barbera was one of the most important animation studios in American television history. They made the Flintstones. They made Yogi Bear. They made Scooby-Doo. By the mid-1990s, they were operating under the Cartoon Network umbrella, producing a series of experimental short films called the World Premiere Toons, or What a Cartoon Showcase. The executives at Hanna-Barbera watched The Life of Larry, and rather than seeing a student project, they saw something worth hiring. MacFarlane was recruited at his senior film festival by a development executive and the president of the studio. He was barely out of college, and he was being offered a job at one of the most storied animation companies in the business. And here is the part that almost nobody knows. He was hired specifically for his writing, not his drawing ability. He was one of the very few people that Hanna-Barbera brought on solely because of how he wrote comedy. His animation skills were serviceable, but the way he constructed jokes and built characters was what impressed them. So MacFarlane moved to Los Angeles and started working at Hanna-Barbera. He wrote and did storyboard work on shows like Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and Dexter's Laboratory. He was learning the mechanics of television animation from the inside, understanding the production pipeline, the pacing, the way you build a comedy around a recurring cast of characters. All of that industrial knowledge was feeding directly into what he was building in his spare time. In 1996, while still working at Hanna-Barbera, MacFarlane created a follow-up to The Life of Larry. He called it Larry and Steve, and it aired the following year as part of the Cartoon Network's world premiere Toons programming. This short was different from its predecessor in a significant way. Where The Life of Larry had been built around Larry as the central character, Larry and Steve shifted the spotlight onto the dog. Steve, the talking dog, became the focus, the intellectual one, the dry observer, the character who looks at the human world with weary amusement and barely concealed exasperation. That dynamic was the DNA of Brian Griffin, not just an inspiration, a direct prototype. MacFarlane based Peter Griffin's voice on something genuinely specific. He has spoken about this in interviews over the years, and the story is one of those wonderfully mundane details that feels almost too ordinary to be true. While he was a student at RISD, he used to walk past a campus security guard's booth on his way to and from classes. This particular security guard talked in a distinctive way, a thick Rhode Island and eastern Massachusetts accent, slow and slightly slurred, conversational in a way that implied a man who thought about things carefully, but arrived at conclusions that were not always worth the journey. MacFarlane listened to that voice, absorbed it, and eventually built an entire character's vocal identity from it. Peter Griffin sounds the way he does because of a security guard whose name most people will never know. The executives at Fox first became aware of MacFarlane not through any formal pitch meeting but through watching the Larry shorts. A development executive at Hanna-Barbera who was working to get back into the primetime television business made the introduction. By 1997 and into 1998, Fox was in conversations with MacFarlane about creating a series. The initial conception, interestingly, was not quite what Family Guy became. As MacFarlane told IGN in 2003, the original plan was for the show to be a series of shorts airing on MAD-TV, Fox's sketch comedy program, in the same way The Simpsons had begun as short segments on The Tracey Ullman Show. The idea was to ease into it, to build an audience in smaller pieces before committing to a full series. But the budget simply was not there to do animation that way on Mad TV. The economics did not work. So the plan changed, and Fox agreed to give MacFarlane a shot at a full primetime series. In May of 1998, Fox signed MacFarlane to a development deal worth $2.5 million a year, a staggering sum for someone his age, and gave him a budget of $50,000 to produce a 15-minute pilot. Presentation? That budget was enough to animate something, but not by much. MacFarlane later said the pilot took him roughly 6 months to create and produce essentially by himself, putting in the kind of hours that would be considered extreme even by Hollywood standards. He was writing, directing, doing the voice work for multiple characters, and overseeing every aspect of the animation in that compressed timeline. The result was the pilot that Fox executives watched and greenlit almost immediately. Family Guy premiered on the 31st of January 1999, following Super Bowl 33 on Fox. That post-Super Bowl time slot is one of the most coveted in American broadcasting. An audience of 22 million people watched the first episode, Death Has a Shadow, because millions of them had simply not changed the channel after the game. That 22 million figure is the number that gets cited most often when people talk about Family Guy's debut. But there is important context around it. The show's first regular season, the episodes that aired starting in April of 1999, averaged 12.8 million viewers and ranked at number 33 in the Nielsen ratings. For a brand new animated comedy on a network that was not CBS or NBC, that was a genuinely strong performance. And Peter Griffin's voice? MacFarlane has also mentioned something else about that character's specific personality, something that goes beyond just the voice. Peter was partly based on the sensibility of the working-class Irish-American men who populated the New England landscape MacFarlane grew up around. Not caricatures of those men, but the specific rhythm of their humor, self-deprecating, affectionate, occasionally oblivious, fundamentally decent underneath the chaos. That specific regional DNA is why early Peter feels like someone you might actually recognize rather than a cartoon construction. One detail that almost never gets mentioned is the name of Peter Griffin's character in his earliest conception. In The Life of Larry, the Peter equivalent character's full name is Larry Cummings. By the time of the Fox pilot, the character had become Peter Griffin. The surname Griffin was chosen partly for its mythological resonance. A griffin is a creature that combines different animals into one being, which reflected the show's hybrid nature. part family sitcom, part cutaway comedy, part cultural satire, all blended into something that did not quite fit any existing category. And Seth MacFarlane's first line in The Life of Larry Short? It was, "Oh, hi there, you scared the crap out of me." He later repeated that exact line verbatim in one of his live-action promotional spots for Family Guy on Adult Swim during the cancellation years. Even the very first words out of his mouth in his creative work were recycled into the show's promotional life. Everything fed back into everything else. The show that premiered in January 1999 was, in every measurable way, the product of a young man's decade of accumulated ideas, half-formed characters, borrowed voices, scrapped and reworked jokes, and a creative instinct that his professor recognized early enough to send it somewhere it could grow. That it became what it became is not really a surprise when you trace the full line. The surprise is how long that line actually was before anyone else saw it. Drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing where this reaches. And if you are enjoying this, hit subscribe. It is completely free and it really does make a difference. Number Section 2. The character's hidden depths and secret histories. Every character on Family Guy has an official biography, a set of traits that the show established early and returned to consistently over its run. But behind each of those official biographies is a second layer, a collection of decisions, accidents, real-world inspirations, and quietly strange facts that most viewers have never encountered. This is that second layer. Start with Peter Griffin, because Peter is where the show lives and breathes. His full name, as established in a later episode, is Peter Löwenbräu Griffin Sr. The Löwenbräu middle name is a joke. Löwenbräu is a brand of German beer, and the implication is that his parents named him after the beverage that was presumably involved in his conception. But his birth name, as revealed in the episode Quagmire's Baby, is actually Justin Peter Griffin. Peter changed it, or more specifically, Peter's official documentation exists under that name, which suggests someone at some point made a cleaner choice for him. Peter's weight has technically never been given an official number in the show's continuity, but the physical design of the character was deliberate and specific. His shape, the wide body, the round head, the tiny chin was based on cartoonist Seth MacFarlane's own observations of how certain body types move and express emotion differently from conventionally proportioned figures. There is more physical comedy available in a round, low-to-the-ground body than a standard one. Every pratfall lands harder. Every moment of confusion reads more clearly on a face with minimal features. The design was functional comedy geometry. Peter's occupation has shifted more than most casual viewers realize. He began the series working at the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory, which was destroyed by an explosion in the Season 2 episode Da Boom, a post-apocalyptic story set during a Y2K disaster that the Griffins somehow survive. After that, Peter became a fisherman briefly, and then eventually settled into his longest-running occupation as a shipping clerk at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery. The brewery setting provided the show with an endless supply of beer-related humor, a convenient explanation for Peter's near-constant intoxication, and a workplace environment that the writers found endlessly useful for plots involving Lois disapproving of something Peter did at work. Lois Griffin's background contains details that the show scattered across many episodes and that, when assembled together, tell a genuinely interesting story. Her maiden name is Pewterschmidt, and her parents Carter and Barbara Pewterschmidt are among the wealthiest people in the fictional version of the state. Carter Pewterschmidt is voiced by Seth MacFarlane himself and is depicted as a ruthless, casually cruel billionaire who has never truly accepted Peter as a worthy husband for his daughter. What is less commonly noted is that Lois's wealthy upbringing was used in a Season 3 episode to reveal that she had a past as a thief. She and a young Peter engaged in shoplifting together early in their relationship, and Lois apparently found the experience electrifying. Lois also has a brother, Patrick, who was revealed to be a convicted serial killer who spent decades in an institution and was known as the Fat Guy Strangler. This reveal was played primarily for comedy, but it also planted a family history of violent instability in Lois's bloodline that the show mostly ignored afterward. The Fat Guy Strangler episode is one of the more genuinely strange hours of early Family Guy, a plot premise so dark that even the show seemed unsure what to do with it, ultimately resolving it through physical comedy rather than anything resembling dramatic closure. Brian Griffin's origins are more emotionally grounded than his later portrayal would suggest. His background was established with unusual specificity in the Season 2 episode Road to Rhode Island, which revealed that Brian was separated from his mother, a dog named Biscuit, when he was very young. Biscuit was bought by a family in Austin, Texas, who had her stuffed after she died. Brian's entire journey in that episode is built around him making peace with his mother's absence and his own complicated feelings about abandonment. The episode ended with what might be one of the most unexpectedly moving musical numbers the show ever produced. Brian singing to his mother's taxidermied form in a storage facility. If you had to pick a single scene from the entire run of the show that demonstrated what the series was capable of at its emotional peak, that one would be on a very short list. Brian's love of martinis is a character trait that MacFarlane has said reflects something of his own sensibility about the been drawn to, with its jazz music, its literary references, and its very specific relationship with alcohol. Brian drinking martinis rather than beer distinguishes him visually and tonally from Peter in every scene they share. One drinks because he is a creature of habit and excess. The other drinks because he has convinced himself it is sophisticated. That difference says everything about both characters without a word of dialogue. Stewie Griffin's accent has a specific origin that is not widely known. MacFarlane has said in interviews that the voice is a blend of Rex Harrison in My Fair Lady and the general cadence of mid-century British theatrical villains, the kind of voice that implies education, condescension, and a total absence of warmth. But there is an additional influence that MacFarlane has mentioned less frequently: the physical comedian Monty Python's influence on the comedic timing within those speeches. Stewie's monologues work because they have the rhythm of British comedy, the long setup, the perfectly placed pause, the abrupt and often violent conclusion. Stewie's name itself carries a small hidden detail. Stewie is a nickname. His full name is Stuart Gilligan Griffin. Gilligan is a reference to Gilligan's Island, the 1960s American sitcom, and its inclusion in the name was a joke about the kind of banal pop culture that a family like the Griffins would name their children after. The contrast between the grandiose, world-dominating personality of the character and the cheerfully idiotic sitcom reference embedded in his legal name was exactly the kind of layered joke that the early writers loved. Meg Griffin's voice situation is more complicated than most people realize, and the story behind it involves a negotiation that almost ended very differently. The original voice of Meg in the show's first season was Lacey Chabert, who was at the time starring in the drama Party of Five. Chabert left the show after the first season because the scheduling demands of her television career made continuing impossible. She has been gracious about it in interviews over the years, expressing no bitterness but acknowledging that the timing simply did not work. Mila Kunis replaced Chabert starting with Season 2. Kunis was 16 years old when she auditioned for the role. She had been playing Jackie Burkhart on That 70s Show since she was 14, and that work brought her to the attention of the Family Guy casting team. MacFarlane has talked about the audition process in several interviews, and he described Kunis's audition as one where she was called back multiple times and given increasingly specific direction to speak more slowly, then to enunciate more clearly, then to find a register in the voice that felt both ordinary and slightly worn down. What is striking about Kunis's casting is that she was, at the point of replacement, still a teenager voicing a teenager, which gave the early Meg episodes after the transition a certain authenticity that got harder to maintain as Kunis aged well beyond the character. Alex Borstein's path to voicing Lois is one of those stories that sounds like Hollywood mythology, but is completely documented and confirmed. She was working on Mad TV, the sketch comedy show, when she was asked to help out with the Family Guy pilot presentation. She went into the booth without having met Seth MacFarlane beforehand, without having seen any of the show's artwork, and essentially created the voice on the spot based on a character she had already been performing in a stage show. That character was a red-headed mother whose voice Borstein had based on a cousin of hers from Long Island, filtered through a slight Eastern European quality. When MacFarlane first heard the voice, his reaction was to ask Borstein to make it less grating and considerably faster. His actual words, as she has recounted in public, were something along the lines of asking her to make it less annoying and speed it up significantly, or every episode would run to 4 hours. Borstein did exactly that, and the result was Lois Griffin. She then had to fight to keep the job when the show went to series. Fox executives wanted to recast the role. She was asked to re-audition alongside, as she described it, every actress who had ever arrived in Hollywood. She won the role again, kept it, and has been lowest for more than 2 decades. Seth Green's audition for Chris Griffin is one of the more delightfully strange stories in the show's history. Green, who was already established as a working actor in film and television, did something in the audition room that could have gone very badly. On a dare from a friend, he performed his entire audition for the role of an awkward teenage boy by doing an impression of Buffalo Bill, the killer, from the 1991 thriller The Silence of the Lambs. Not the generic voice of a teenage boy. The specific, menacing, unsettling vocal performance of a fictional serial killer, and it worked. The producers found it funny enough, and the general quality of Seth Green's performance convincing enough that he was cast. The connection between Chris's awkward, slightly off-putting vocal quality and the Buffalo Bill impression that inspired it even became a joke within the show itself. When an episode had Meg embarrass Chris in front of the school by showing video of him imitating that exact character. Patrick Warburton, who voices Joe Swanson, is perhaps the most literal casting choice in the show's history. Joe Swanson is a physically imposing, deep-voiced police officer who projects authority and competence in every scene. Patrick Warburton is 6 feet 3 inches tall, with a voice that sounds like it was constructed in a factory specifically for the purpose of commanding rooms. When the two are described back to back, it feels less like casting and more like matching socks. Warburton had been playing a similarly confident, slightly oblivious archetype in the sitcom Seinfeld, where he played Elaine's boyfriend, David Puddy, and the Family Guy producers recognized that his particular brand of good-natured, slightly dim authority would work perfectly for a neighborhood cop in a cartoon. Neil Goldman, the nerdy classmate who frequently appears as a foil for Meg in school scenes, has an origin that is one of the funnier behind-the-scenes facts the show has produced. The character is named after one of the actual writers in the Family Guy writers' room, a real person named Neil Goldman, who co-wrote multiple early episodes of the show. The joke is that the other writers, who apparently found their colleague's personality sufficiently nerdy, simply put his name on the most socially awkward character they could construct and ran with it. The real Neil Goldman did not name the character himself. His colleagues did it to him. He was not given a veto. The character went on to become a recurring presence in the show for years, which means that somewhere in the world, a real person with that name has had to live with a fictional version of himself being publicly humiliated in animated form on a national broadcast network for decades. Number. Section 3. The Cancelled Years. What really happened? Family Guy is famous for being the show that came back from the dead. That is the simplified version of the story. And like most simplified versions of complex stories, it captures the shape of what happened without really explaining the texture of it. The full account of why Family Guy was canceled, how it survived, and what made its return both triumphant and quietly complicated is considerably richer than the legend suggests. The show's first cancellation is the one that most people know about, even if imprecisely. What actually happened is this. Family Guy's first season premiered in April of 1999, following the post-Super Bowl pilot, and performed solidly on Sunday nights after The Simpsons. That Sunday night slot immediately following The Simpsons on Fox was one of the best possible positions an animated comedy could occupy on American television at the time. The audience was already there, already warmed up, already in the right frame of mind for adult animation. Then Fox moved the show. During its second season, Fox shifted Family Guy to Thursday nights at 9 o'clock. That placed it directly opposite Frasier on NBC, which was at the height of its cultural popularity and drawing massive audiences in that time slot. Frasier was a reliably excellent, award-winning comedy with a loyal viewership. Family Guy, a new and unconventional show still finding its audience, was not equipped to compete for the same viewers. The ratings dropped significantly. Fox responded by moving the show again, this time to Tuesday nights, where it found itself opposite Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC. That quiz show was the phenomenon of the 1999 and 2000 television season, drawing enormous audiences almost every time it aired. Family Guy could not compete with it in that time slot either. The audience, which needed consistency and predictability to build, kept being scattered. People who wanted to watch the show simply could not find it reliably. By the end of the second season, the viewership had eroded dramatically, and Fox made the decision to cancel. The show came back for a brief third season in 2001, but the damage had been done. At the end of the third season in 2002, Fox canceled Family Guy for what everyone assumed would be the final time. There is a detail about that second cancellation that is often overlooked. When the show was canceled after its third season, one episode remained unaired. That episode, Family Guy viewer male, no. One eventually premiered on Adult Swim in 2003 rather than on Fox, which meant it became part of the syndication package rather than part of the show's original broadcast run. This left the show's third season incomplete in its Fox form, and created the kind of accounting confusion about episode numbering that still affects how collectors and streaming services organize the show's catalog to this day. The decision by Cartoon Network to purchase the syndication rights to Family Guy was made when the show's market value was essentially at rock bottom. Nobody at Fox thought it was worth much anymore. Nobody in the broader television industry was particularly interested. Family Guy had been canceled. It was a dead property from the perspective of the people whose job it is to assign dollar values to television properties. Cartoon Network acquired those rights for what multiple sources have described as a very small amount of money relative to what they would eventually prove to be worth. The reruns premiered on Adult Swim on the 20th of April 2003, and within weeks, something happened that the television industry genuinely did not have a framework for at the time. The show became the most watched program on the entire Adult Swim block. Not one of the most watched. It dominated its time slot against both cable and broadcast competition, and it boosted Adult Swim's overall viewership by 239%. 239%. A canceled show that nobody wanted had become the engine driving an entire programming block's growth. The explanation for this is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reflects something interesting about how audiences actually work. Family Guy had not gotten worse between its broadcast run and its Adult Swim run. The episodes were the same. What had changed was who was watching and under what conditions. Late-night cable television attracted a younger demographic: college students, young adults, people in their early 20s who were staying up late and channel surfing. This was precisely the audience that Family Guy's specific blend of pop culture references, irreverent humor, and generational sensibility resonated with most strongly. Fox had been scheduling it against middle American family competition in primetime. Adult Swim was putting it in front of the people who were always going to love it most at the exact time of night when they were most receptive. The DVD release added another dimension to the story. The complete first and second seasons were released on DVD and sold more than 2.2 million copies. That made the Family Guy Season 1 DVD set the second best-selling television DVD release of its time, behind only the first season of Chappelle's Show on Comedy Central. For a canceled animated sitcom that the network had essentially abandoned, these were numbers that made executives sit up and pay attention. By 2004, Fox had seen enough. The network that had canceled Family Guy twice made the extraordinary decision to order new episodes. A fourth season was commissioned. This was, at the time, essentially without precedent in American broadcast television. Shows got canceled. They did not come back because their fans missed them too much. The economics simply did not work that way, or had not, until Family Guy demonstrated that they could. MacFarlane has talked in interviews about what those years between the second cancellation and the 2005 revival actually felt like from the inside. The writing staff that had created those first 3 seasons had dispersed. People had found other work. The team that made those episodes was not waiting around for a call that most of them assumed was never coming. When the show was greenlit again, MacFarlane and the producers had to essentially rebuild the writing room. Some original writers came back. Many did not, because their careers had moved on to other projects and commitments. New writers were brought in who had not been part of the show's original development. The creative chemistry that had existed in the early seasons was not something that could simply be reinstalled like software. It had to be rebuilt, and rebuilding something is different from building it the first time. What is particularly interesting about the cancellation period is what was happening in the broader culture during those years. The internet was growing rapidly. Video sharing platforms were emerging. The ability for fans to organize around a canceled show to demonstrate their loyalty through measurable consumer behavior like buying DVDs was a genuinely new phenomenon in 2003 and 2004. Family Guy was not the first show to benefit from internet fan communities, but it was among the earliest and most dramatic examples of a show's survival being directly connected to fan behavior in digital spaces. The people who bought those DVDs and watched those Adult Swim reruns were not just passive consumers. They were, without necessarily organizing deliberately, making a collective economic argument that the show should exist. And the argument worked. The fourth season premiered on the 1st of May 2005, and became an immediate success by the rating standards of the day. The show returned to Sunday nights as part of Fox's animation domination lineup, which at that point also included The Simpsons, King of the Hill, and MacFarlane's new creation, American Dad, which had debuted in February of that same year. Family Guy was back, and for the moment, everything seemed to have been restored to something approximating its original state. Except that it had not been. And that is the part of the cancellation story that is rarely told with sufficient attention. The 3 years away changed the show in ways that were not immediately obvious. The new writing room brought different sensibilities. The characters who had been established in those first 3 seasons were now being written by a combination of people who had known them from the beginning and people who were meeting them for the first time through reading scripts and watching episodes rather than through the experience of developing them from scratch. That is a subtle difference, but it is not a small one. The show that returned in 2005 was Family Guy, but it was also, in ways that would only become clearer over time, a replica of Family Guy, something built to resemble the original without having been grown in the same conditions. The specific way the cancellation affected the show's tone is something that MacFarlane himself has acknowledged. The instability being canceled, being revived, being canceled again, being revived again, meant that the writing staff was in a state of constant flux. Bringing in new writers is not inherently damaging to a show. Fresh perspectives can reinvigorate a creative team that has been working together for too long. But when turnover is high and continuity is disrupted, the institutional memory of a show, the accumulated understanding of what the characters would and would not do, what the show's particular sense of humor actually was, where the lines were, becomes harder to maintain. The cancellation years are also where the myth of Family Guy's invincibility was born. The show had cheated death twice and come back stronger. That story became part of the brand. It gave the show a kind of defiant resilience in the public imagination. But that myth also created a problem going forward. It became very difficult for anyone, Fox executives, producers, MacFarlane himself, to ever say with conviction that the show should stop, because it had already survived things that should have killed it. Every time declining ratings or creative fatigue suggested that the end might be approaching, the story of the 2 cancellations was there as a counter-argument. The show had been here before. It had always come back. That narrative has followed Family Guy for 2 decades now. It is a compelling story. It is also, in some ways, a trap. Section 4. The Writer's Room: Chaos, Genius, and Dark Secrets. Television comedy writers' rooms are strange places. They are environments where a group of people sit in a room for hours, often in uncomfortable physical conditions, competing to make each other laugh. The funniest idea wins. The second funniest idea gets noted down and used later. The ideas that land with silence get quietly buried. It is a specific kind of creative pressure that produces a specific kind of result, humor that has been stress-tested in front of an audience of professional comedy people before it ever reaches an actual audience of viewers. The Family Guy writers' room has a reputation, not always entirely flattering, for being one of the more intense environments in animated television. The show produces somewhere between 14 and 22 episodes per season, depending on the year, and each of those episodes requires a complete story with multiple subplots, dozens of cutaway gags, at least several musical possibilities, and enough material to fill approximately 22 minutes of screen time. That is an enormous output demand, and it creates the conditions for both brilliance and exhaustion in roughly equal measure. One of the least discussed aspects of how Family Guy is actually written is the table read process. Before an episode is animated, before any visual work happens at all, the entire cast gathers together in a room and reads the script aloud while the writing staff listens. The writers are not just there to observe, they are there to watch the room, to gauge which jokes land and which ones produce silence or awkward laughter or genuine discomfort. After the table read, the script goes back into the writer's room for revisions based on what worked and what did not. This means every episode of Family Guy has essentially been through a live comedy performance before it is ever touched by an animator. The table read environment for Family Guy is described by people who have attended it as an experience that can be both thrilling and slightly terrifying. Seth MacFarlane, when he was most actively involved in the show, was reportedly extremely precise about what he wanted. He had a specific sense of humor informed by his love of old Hollywood musicals, classic comedy writing, vintage animation, and a particular kind of absurdist intelligence, and he was not shy about saying when something did not meet the standard he had in his head. The pressure to make MacFarlane laugh in a table read was significant, because his laughter was effectively the green light for a joke to survive into the final episode. The show's writing staff has included some people who became quite well known in their own right after leaving. Writers who got their start or their early career experience in the Family Guy room went on to work on other major animated shows, write for live-action comedies, and create their own projects. The room was a training ground, which is both a testament to the quality of the education it provided and a partial explanation for the turnover that kept affecting the show's creative continuity. Neil Goldman, the real one, after whom the nerdy character was named, co-wrote several of the most fondly remembered early episodes alongside his writing partner Garrett Donovan. The two of them left the show after the early seasons to pursue other projects, including eventually working on the live-action comedy Scrubs. Their departure was part of the general dispersal of the original writing team that made the cancellation and revival such a difficult creative moment. The specific chemistry of those early episodes existed in part because of who Goldman and Donovan brought to the room, a certain kind of comedy sensibility that did not automatically transfer when new writers arrived. The cutaway gag process is something that most viewers have never thought about in procedural terms. How does a cutaway actually get written? In the Family Guy room, the process typically begins with someone pitching a setup line, a sentence that a character says that ends with something like, "This is worse than the time," or "remember when." Once that setup is on the table, the writers essentially hold an open competition. Anyone in the room can pitch what comes next. The pitches can be completely unrelated to anything else in the episode. They can reference anything from current events to obscure pop culture to personal experience. The only criterion is it funny? If enough people in the room laugh, the cutaway goes in. If it does not land, the pitch is discarded and someone else tries. This process has several effects on the show's texture. It means that the cutaways in any given episode are the product of a genuinely competitive comedy environment. Only the strongest jokes survive. But it also means that the connection between a cutaway and the episode's main story is often essentially non-existent. The setup line is sometimes retrofitted after the cutaway is already chosen. Someone writes a funny scene, and then someone else figures out how to create a line of dialogue that makes sense as an entry point. This is the creative process that South Park's Trey Parker and Matt Stone mocked with their manatee and idea balls bit in Cartoon Wars. And while that criticism was delivered from a place of competitive rivalry, it was not entirely wrong as a description of how the mechanism works. Writers who have worked on Family Guy have spoken in various interviews about the specific culture of the room. There is something interesting about the difference between shows that are written in a hierarchical way, where the showrunner essentially dictates and the other writers fill in details, and shows that are written in a genuinely collaborative, pitch-based way. Family Guy has operated more toward the collaborative end of the spectrum, particularly as MacFarlane stepped back from active day-to-day involvement. That democracy of pitching means that the room's collective sensibility has a strong influence on what the show becomes. When the collective sensibility shifts because writers leave, because new people arrive with different instincts, because the cultural moment changes, the show shifts with it. One of the more interesting structural facts about how Family Guy operates is that the voice recording and the animation are essentially separate processes that happen simultaneously but independently. Voice actors record their lines in a studio, and those recordings are then used as the basis for the animation that is created overseas. The animators are working from the script and the voice recordings, not from any real-time interaction with the cast. This means that choices made by voice actors during their recording sessions, a specific emphasis, an unexpected pause, a laugh that creeps into a delivery, can only be responded to in the animation if the overseas studio has both the time and the direction to do so. Often, they work from a standard set of instructions without being able to incorporate subtle performance nuances. MacFarlane is exceptional among the show's cast members in that he voices 4 of the show's major recurring characters, Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, as well as numerous minor and one-off characters in virtually every episode. The stamina required to maintain 4 distinct vocal performances in a single recording session is considerable, and MacFarlane has described the experience of switching rapidly between Peter's slow, oblivious delivery and Stewie's clipped, precise British-influenced cadence as requiring genuine mental preparation. He essentially has to inhabit 4 entirely different people within the span of a few hours each week. The show maintains a permanent orchestra for its musical numbers. It is a group of 40 to 60 musicians whose job it is to record live instrumental accompaniment for every original song and musical sequence the show produces. In an era when most television shows use digital instruments and synthesized music, Family Guy's commitment to live orchestration for its comedy songs is unusual and expensive. It also produces a sound quality that distinguishes the show's musical moments from everything else in the animated comedy landscape. When Peter and the guys break into a show-stopping number in a bar, the music underneath them sounds like a real Broadway pit orchestra because it essentially is one. This was a condition MacFarlane fought for and maintained across the show's run because his love of classic musical theater was, and remains, completely genuine. The question of who holds creative authority over the show in MacFarlane's reduced role is one that the show has never addressed publicly with full transparency. The showrunners Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin have been publicly credited for years, but the internal dynamics of creative decision-making in a writer's room are rarely simple. What is publicly known is that MacFarlane continues to review material, that his voice remains literally present in every episode through his voice work, and that he has expressed opinions publicly, sometimes quite pointed ones, about the direction of shows he is associated with. Whether those opinions carry the weight they once did in the actual production process is something only the people inside the room could say with authority. What the writer's room history of Family Guy ultimately reveals is that the show has always been more of a living organism than a fixed creation. It responds to who is in the room. It reflects the humor that the current writing staff finds funny, which is not always the same humor that the original writing staff found funny. It absorbs the cultural moment, the things people are talking about, the celebrities who are generating headlines, the political events that are producing strong reactions, and processes them through its own particular machinery. Sometimes that machinery produces something genuinely extraordinary. Sometimes it produces something that feels like it was assembled rather than written. The writer's room is where both of those outcomes are determined, often within the same episode. Number Section 5. Voice acting secrets and behind-the-mic stories. If you have spent any amount of time watching Family Guy closely, you have probably noticed that the voice cast is remarkably small relative to the number of characters who appear in any given episode. This is by design and by necessity. Maintaining a large permanent cast for an animated show is extraordinarily expensive, and the economics of television animation have always pushed toward using your existing cast for as many roles as possible. But in Family Guy's case, this has created some genuinely remarkable situations and some behind-the-scenes facts that most viewers have never had reason to think about. Seth MacFarlane's range as a voice actor is genuinely unusual. Beyond Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, he regularly voices minor characters, one-off figures, celebrities who appear in brief gags, and background characters who need a quick line. His cartoon show creator credit can sometimes obscure the fact that he is, in purely technical terms, one of the more versatile voice performers working in American animation. He can transition between a working-class Rhode Island accent, a mid-Atlantic aristocratic British accent, an affected pseudo-sophisticated dog's world-weary observations, and the sleazy swagger of Glenn Quagmire within the span of a single recording session, sometimes within minutes of each other. Quagmire's voice has an interesting origin that MacFarlane has discussed in interviews. Glenn Quagmire was conceived as a character who was simultaneously charming and deeply suspect, a man whose surface affability concealed a personality that would be genuinely alarming if examined too closely. The voice MacFarlane developed for him reflects this. It has a salesman's smoothness, a certain retro quality that suggests a man who thinks of himself as existing in a perpetual 1960s, a man who has memorized the moves without understanding the substance behind them. MacFarlane based the vocal quality partly on the classic lounge singer and pitchman archetype, the voice of mid-century television advertisements, filtered through a kind of lecherous knowingness. Quagmire's age is a continuity detail that the show played with in a way that became a running joke. The character is stated, at various points in the show, to be in his early 40s, which is broadly consistent with his peer group of Peter, Joe, and Cleveland. However, in the Season 7 episode Tales of a Third Grade Nothing, Quagmire's age was revealed through a driver's license to be 61. This was walked back in later episodes, and the age discrepancy was never formally resolved. It became the kind of continuity inconsistency that the show acknowledges with a shrug and moves on from, treating its own internal logic as roughly aspirational. The voice of Bonnie Swanson, Joe's wife, has had an unusual history across the show's run. Bonnie was originally voiced by Jennifer Tilly, the film actress known for her distinctively breathy, high-pitched voice. In later seasons, the character has been voiced by other performers. Jo Swanson's wife spent years pregnant within the show's continuity she was expecting when the character was first introduced, and remained in that state for what has been calculated by fans to be somewhere between 7 and 8 years of in-show time before finally giving birth. This was not originally intended as a long-running gag. It became one by accident, because the writers kept not getting around to resolving the pregnancy, and eventually the delay itself became funnier than any individual resolution would have been. The giant chicken Ernie, as he is sometimes named, is one of the show's most iconic recurring elements, and his voice and physical design have a specific creative history. The fights between Peter and the giant chicken began as a joke about escalation. Peter has a small grievance with a character who gives him an expired coupon, and instead of resolving it proportionately, the situation devolves into an extended, elaborately choreographed action sequence. The joke is the duration and the intensity of the conflict relative to its absurdly minor cause. The chicken fights became beloved enough that they are now among the most technically ambitious animation the show produces, with storyboard artists and overseas animators given specific direction to make each iteration more elaborate than the last. The most recent chicken fights involve destruction on a scale that would not look out of place in a summer blockbuster film, which is entirely the point. Danny Smith, one of the show's writers, is listed in the credits as the voice of Ernie the Giant Chicken in many episodes. Smith has been with the show from the beginning, one of the few connections to the original writing team who has remained through decades of transition, and his role extends beyond writing to include voice performance on one of the show's most distinctive recurring bits. Alex Borstein's multi-character work on Family Guy is less celebrated than MacFarlane's, but no less impressive. Beyond Lois, Borstein regularly voices Lois's mother, Barbara Pewterschmidt, Tricia Takanawa, the Asian-American television reporter who appears in news segments, Loretta Brown, who was Cleveland's first wife, and a rotating collection of additional characters across the show's episodes. The vocal range required to move between Lois's Long Island warmth, Barbara's wealthy irritability, and Tricia's newsroom professionalism is genuinely demanding, and Borstein moves between them with an ease that comes from more than 2 decades of working within the same fictional world. The recording process for Family Guy is something that distinguishes it from live-action television in ways that have interesting creative implications. When a live-action comedy show records, the actors are in the same room, responding to each other's performances in real time. The chemistry of that interaction, the way one person's timing affects another's delivery, the spontaneous moments that happen when performers are actually looking at each other, is baked into the final product. Voice acting for animation is different. Each actor typically records separately, reading their lines with only the script and a director as guides. The other characters' voices are not present in the room. They exist only in the actor's imagination and in the stage directions on the page. This creates a specific kind of performance pressure. Every voice actor has to be internally consistent, has to understand where their character is emotionally at every moment of the scene, without having the literal presence of another actor to react to. MacFarlane has described this as one of the aspects of voice acting that he finds genuinely challenging, maintaining the rhythm of a conversation when the other half of the conversation is absent. The scenes between Peter and Brian, which have always been among the most dynamically written exchanges in the show, were not recorded with MacFarlane literally going back and forth with himself in real time. He recorded Peter's lines in one pass, then shifted modes and recorded Brian's lines in another. Patrick Warburton's work as Jo Swanson has produced one of the show's more unusual ongoing character situations. Jo is a police officer who uses a wheelchair, having been injured in the line of duty specifically. In the backstory established in his first episode, A Hero Sits Next Door in Season 1, he was injured trying to stop a criminal dressed as the Grinch from stealing Christmas presents. The physical comedy available to an animated character in a wheelchair is different from what is available to most characters, and the show has used Jo's situation both sensitively in some early episodes and, in later seasons, as a target for humor that became increasingly uncomfortable. Warburton brings a particular genuine authority to the voice that makes Jo consistently feel like someone whose dignity matters, even in episodes where the writing does not always honor that. The late Adam West's work as Mayor Adam West, a character essentially playing a demented, fictional version of himself, was one of the show's most beloved recurring bits. West, who found national fame as Batman in the 1966 television series, was cast in a role that allowed him to engage with his own legend in the most absurd way possible. The character is named Adam West, looks like Adam West, and is the mayor of the show's fictional town. His behavior is completely irrational, often dangerous, and guided by a thought process that operates entirely outside normal human logic. West committed to the role with a total lack of self-consciousness that made every appearance a treat. He voiced the character from the show's earliest seasons until his death in 2017, and the show dedicated an episode to his memory that year. His passing was one of the genuine losses in the show's long history, a performer who had found in Family Guy a creative second life that might have surprised even him, and who inhabited it completely. Number Section 6. The censored episodes and banned controversies. Family Guy has spent more than 25 years in an ongoing negotiation with the people whose job it is to decide what goes on American television and what does not. The Federal Communications Commission has received complaints about the show. The Parents Television Council has named it to their worst shows list multiple times. Fox's own Standards and Practices Department has had to make calls about specific jokes, specific scenes, and in a small number of cases, specific entire episodes that it was not prepared to air. What follows is the full accounting of those moments, the things that were cut, the things that were banned, and the things that created international incidents. The most famous banned episode is Partial Terms of Endearment, the Season 8 episode that dealt with abortion. The story centers on Lois agreeing to be a surrogate mother for one of her old college friends. When the friend and her husband die in a car accident, Lois is left carrying a baby without any living people to hand it back to, and the episode follows her and Peter through a genuinely thoughtful for Family Guy examination of the abortion debate. Both sides are presented and mocked in roughly equal measure. The episode does not take a position so much as it dramatizes the impossibility of a position. Fox made the decision not to air it. This was, as of the time of writing, a decision that has remained in place. The episode has never broadcast on American television. It is available on the Season 8 DVD release, and it aired in several international markets including the United Kingdom, where it was watched by just under 1 million homes in its original airing. Fox also made the unusual request that Adult Swim, which was at the time airing Family Guy reruns, honor their decision not to air the episode, and Adult Swim complied. Seth MacFarlane expressed frustration with the decision publicly, arguing that the episode's handling of the subject was more nuanced than Fox was giving it credit for, but the network held firm. The episode was announced at the 2009 San Diego Comic-Con, where its existence generated significant attention. The fact that a Family Guy episode existed that had never aired in America was treated as something between a scandal and a curiosity. People who tracked down copies through DVDs, through international streaming, generally found that the episode was more thoughtful than the controversy suggested, which perhaps says something about the difficulty of predicting how complex content will land before it exists in the world. The earlier banned episode, When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, is a different kind of story. That episode was completed and ready to air in 2000 as part of the show's second season, but Fox executives pulled it from the schedule. Their concern was that the episode's central premise, Peter believing that Jewish people have a natural aptitude for financial matters and trying to get his son Chris converted to Judaism, would be perceived as anti-Semitic. MacFarlane has always maintained that the episode was intended as satire of that exact stereotype, using Peter's credulousness as the vehicle for mocking the absurdity of the belief rather than endorsing it. The episode also featured a song called I Need a Jew, performed to the tune of When You Wish Upon a Star from Pinocchio, which became the subject of a separate legal dispute. The episode eventually aired on Adult Swim in 2003 and then on Fox itself in 2004, and the general reception was that the satirical intent MacFarlane claimed was relatively apparent. The Road to Rhode Island episode has an edit that most viewers have seen without realizing it is an edit. The episode originally contained a scene where Stewie, having successfully used a show tune to distract airport security from noticing the weapons in his luggage, mutters, "Let's hope Osama bin Laden doesn't know show tunes." The camera then cut to bin Laden himself in a security line, singing I Hope I Get It from a chorus line as his own weapon-filled luggage passed through the scanner. The scene aired once, in May of 2000. More than a year later, the September 11th attacks occurred, and the scene was quietly removed from all subsequent airings and from the initial DVD release. It was eventually restored to the episode on the Freakin' Sweet Collection DVD and later on Hulu. The show's DVD commentary on that episode included MacFarlane making a dry observation that the FBI should have been watching Family Guy more often. That observation carried unusual weight, because MacFarlane had his own deeply personal reason to think carefully about the events of September 11th. On the morning of the 11th of September 2001, Seth MacFarlane was booked on American Airlines Flight 1 departing from Boston's Logan International Airport. That flight was among those hijacked in the attacks. MacFarlane missed it. His travel agent had given him an incorrect departure time. The agent told him the flight left at 8:15 in the morning, when the actual departure time was 7:45. Additionally, MacFarlane had been out drinking the previous night. He had been giving a lecture at RISD and had gone out with faculty members afterward and was somewhat the worse for it when he woke up that morning. He arrived at the gate approximately 10 minutes after it had closed. He was told he had missed the flight and was rebooked on a later departure. He went into the airport lounge and fell asleep. He woke up 45 minutes later to the commotion of people around him, learning that the first plane had struck the North Tower. He learned shortly after that the flight he had missed was Flight 11. He has spoken about the experience multiple times over the years, consistently framing it not as a miraculous survival or a sign of anything greater, but simply as a very close call that happened to him and that he processes by trying not to dwell on the alternate possibilities. He sent his travel agent a basket of wine and spirits as a thank you. The Venezuela incident is another chapter in the show's international controversy history that does not get discussed nearly enough. A Season 7 episode called 420 dealt with Brian leading a campaign to legalize marijuana in the show's fictional town. The episode was neither the first nor the most extreme drug-related content in the show's history, but it provoked a specific and notable international reaction. The Venezuelan government, specifically, the country's justice minister at the time, publicly condemned the episode as American propaganda promoting drug use to young people. Cable television stations in Venezuela were formally warned that they would face fines if they continued to air Family Guy. The show was effectively banned in the country. This was not the first time a cartoon comedy had caused an international incident, but it was a genuinely unusual situation for a broadcast network program to navigate. The Turban Cowboy episode from Season 11 attracted a different kind of controversy, and one that had more to do with timing than content. The episode, which involved Peter accidentally becoming involved with a terrorist organization, was pulled from subsequent airings and from streaming services after the Boston Marathon bombing occurred in April of 2013. This was not a censorship decision in the formal sense. The episode had already aired, and its content was not actually changed. But Fox made the decision to remove it from online availability temporarily because the subject matter felt uncomfortably proximate to a real act of violence that had just occurred in the same city where the show is set. The episode eventually returned to availability. The PTV episode, which directly attacked the FCC and the practice of broadcast censorship, contains what might be the show's most audacious regulatory joke. The episode features Peter starting his own uncensored television network after the FCC begins aggressively censoring existing broadcasts. The centerpiece musical number, the FCC Song, is a parody of a real musical theater piece that essentially lists every piece of content the FCC has historically objected to while performing those very things on screen. The song was performed at the Emmy Awards the following year in a modified form. And the real FCC, the actual Federal Communications Commission that the song was mocking, reportedly loved it. This created the bizarre situation where the regulatory body that the show was attacking found the attack charming, which made Peter, within the episode's logic, extremely angry. The show has also made several references over the years that required quiet editing after specific real-world events made them uncomfortable. A scene involving a bomb in a building that aired shortly before a real bombing would be removed from reruns. A joke involving a specific celebrity who had subsequently died would be cut from the version of the episode available on streaming. These micro-edits accumulate over a show's 25-year run into a quiet archaeological record of moments where fiction and reality got uncomfortably close. Number. Section 7. Real people, real lawsuits, real consequences. Family Guy has an unusual relationship with the public figures it portrays, parodies, and occasionally insults in considerable detail. The show operates under a legal framework that treats parody of public figures differently from defamation of private individuals, and it has consistently tested the boundaries of that framework throughout its run. Several times those tests have resulted in actual legal proceedings. The story of those lawsuits is both a legal education and a practical guide to exactly how far a comedy show can push before someone decides to push back. The Carol Burnett lawsuit is the most famous, and it established an important precedent. The Season 4 episode Peterotica aired in April of 2006. In it, Peter visits an adult bookstore, and his companion Quagmire reassures him about the establishment's cleanliness by noting that Carol Burnett works there part-time as a janitor. The camera then panned to a cartoon version of Burnett's charwoman character, her signature cleaning lady persona from the Carol Burnett show mopping the floor. The characters also performed Burnett's famous ear tug, a personal signature gesture that she had used at the end of every episode of her variety show, and the scene used an altered version of the Carol Burnett show theme music. Burnett sued 20th Century Fox in March of 2007 for $2 million. The lawsuit alleged copyright infringement, violation of her publicity rights, and misappropriation of her name and likeness. This was a serious legal claim, not a frivolous one. Burnett had legitimate ownership interests in her characters and her specific performances, and the show had used them without seeking permission. The court ruled in Fox's favor. The judge found that the use of the charwoman character in a comedy context constituted parody protected by the First Amendment. Parody, by its legal definition, requires using the recognizable elements of the original work in order to comment on or mock that work or its creator. The charwoman being placed in an adult bookstore was commentary, however crude, on the idea of a beloved family television figure being associated with something inappropriate. That satirical function, the court found, was sufficient to place the use within the bounds of protected speech. The judge acknowledged that the portrayal was distasteful, but found that distasteful speech is not automatically unprotected speech. The case was dismissed. The lawsuit over When You Wish Upon a Weinstein took a different form. The complaint came not from a person but from a music publisher. The song I Need a Jew, sung by Peter in that episode, was a parody of When You Wish Upon a Star, the Academy Award-winning song from the 1940 Disney animated film Pinocchio. The owner of the publishing rights to the original song, a company called Born Co. Music Publishers, filed a copyright infringement lawsuit in October of 2007. Their argument was that the Family Guy version distorted the original song in a way that damaged its commercial and reputational value. This was a more legally interesting case than the Burnett suit, because it touched on a distinction that courts have had to work out repeatedly in American copyright law: the difference between parody and satire. Parody, legally speaking, targets the work it is borrowing from. Satire uses borrowed material as a vehicle to make commentary on something else. The Born Company argued that the song I Need a Jew was not really commenting on When You Wish Upon a Star. It was using that melody to make jokes about Jewish stereotypes. Since the joke was not about the original song itself, they argued, it was not protected parody. The case was decided in Fox's favor in March of 2009. The presiding judge determined that using the melody to parodically mirror the earnest hopefulness of When You Wish Upon a Star with a nakedly bigoted wish was, in fact, a form of commentary on the original song's naive optimism and on the human tendency to invest that kind of wishing in things that are embarrassing or wrong. The legal reasoning was fairly technical, but the practical result was that the episode, which had already been airing for years, remained legally intact. The show has also attracted attention from figures who did not sue, but made their displeasure publicly known. Sarah Palin, the former governor of Alaska and 2008 vice presidential candidate, took specific exception to a Season 8 episode called Extra Large Medium, in which a character with Down syndrome appeared and mentioned that her mother was the former governor of Alaska. Palin's son Trig has Down syndrome, and she interpreted the character as a direct reference to him or to her family. The episode was written by McFarlane and the writer's room, and the voice of the Down syndrome character was provided by Andrea Faye Friedman, a woman who herself has Down syndrome, who said publicly that she found the episode funny and saw no reason for offense. This created an unusual situation where the person whose condition was being represented did not object, while the public figure who claimed to be targeted was vocal about her displeasure. McFarlane's public response was characteristically blunt. The show's treatment of celebrities in news segments, cutaway gags, and extended parody episodes has occasionally produced responses from the celebrities themselves, ranging from public statements of displeasure to direct requests to the show to stop. The show has occasionally obliged these requests when legal pressure was applied, or when the continued use of someone's likeness created risks that the network's legal team determined were not worth taking. More often, the show has continued doing what it was doing, relying on the parody protection that the Burnett case helped establish. One category of legal risk that the show has navigated carefully is the use of real brand names and real corporations as subjects of humor. Brands in comedic contexts exist in a legal gray area. A joke that implies a product is dangerous or fraudulent is qualitatively different from a joke that simply places a recognizable brand in an absurd situation. Family Guy has generally been careful to keep its brand-adjacent jokes in the absurdist category, which reduces but does not eliminate the legal exposure. The international dimension of the show's legal and regulatory issues is worth noting. The Venezuela ban has already been discussed. Family Guy has also faced restrictions in parts of the Middle East, where the show's treatment of religion, particularly its depictions of God and Allah, in various episodes created broadcasting challenges. The British regulatory environment has sometimes required edits for UK broadcast that are different from the American version of episodes, particularly around specific jokes about public figures and around content involving minors. The show's willingness to continue pushing into legally uncomfortable territory, even after multiple lawsuits, reflects something deliberate about its creative identity. MacFarlane has stated publicly that the show's process involves asking, for each joke, whether it could be defended intellectually, whether there is a satirical or comedic purpose that justifies the content. That does not mean every joke passes that test. It means the test is being applied, which is a different thing from recklessness, even if the results are sometimes indistinguishable to outside observers. Number. Section 8. The animation secrets most fans never notice. Every frame of Family Guy is produced through a process that most viewers have never had reason to think about. A process that is considerably more complex, more geographically distributed, and more technically interesting than the finished product would suggest. The animation that appears on screen is the result of creative work done in Los Angeles, production work done in several different overseas studios, and a quality control pipeline that runs across multiple time zones and continents. Understanding that pipeline illuminates details about the show's visual history that are otherwise invisible. Family Guy's animation has changed more dramatically over its run than most people realize, because the changes happen gradually and the differences between any two adjacent seasons are subtle. But compare a Season 1 episode to a Season 10 episode to a current episode, and the differences are substantial. The characters look different, they move differently. The visual energy of the show has shifted. Each of these changes corresponds to specific decisions about which studios were handling the animation at particular points in the show's history. The original seasons of Family Guy, the first through third, were animated primarily by Film Roman, a Los Angeles-based studio that had also worked on The Simpsons. Film Roman's work gave the early episodes a specific quality, slightly rough around the edges, with a looseness of movement that felt organic and alive. The characters moved in ways that had a certain unpredictability to them, a quality that suited the show's anarchic humor. Rough Draft Studios handled significant portions of Seasons 2 and 3, and fans who are attentive to animation styles often point to those seasons as having particularly expressive character work. When the show returned for Season 4 in 2005, the animation moved to a different configuration. Hong Ying Animation, a Taiwanese studio with satellite operations in mainland China, became one of the primary overseas production houses. Hong Ying had not previously worked on Family Guy, and how they became involved is described by sources within the fan community as somewhat murky. It is believed that Seth MacFarlane hired them partly because other studios that had been involved with the show were occupied with other projects during the revival period. Hong Ying's style was noticeably cleaner and more consistent than the earlier seasons, but also stiffer. The characters moved with less spontaneity, and the overall visual texture shifted towards something more polished but slightly less warm. Digital E-Mation, a South Korean animation studio, has been the dominant overseas production house for Family Guy from roughly Season 9 onward, and is currently the studio that handles the vast majority of the show's animation. Their style is technically precise and consistent, which means the show looks very uniform in its later seasons. There are few of the visual inconsistencies that you sometimes see in the earlier seasons when different studios were handling different episodes in ways that were not perfectly synchronized. But that consistency comes at the cost of some of the idiosyncratic quality that made the earlier seasons feel handmade. Each episode of Family Guy takes approximately 10 months to a year to complete from concept to finished broadcast. MacFarlane revealed this in a 2026 interview, and the hosts of the program where he made this disclosure were visibly surprised. For a show that produces 15 to 22 episodes per season, this means that multiple episodes are in various stages of production simultaneously at any given time. Some are being written, some are being storyboarded, some are in voice recording, some are being animated overseas, some are in post-production, and some are in the final editing stage before broadcast. The show exists as a kind of creative assembly line where different parts of different episodes are moving through different stages of production at the same moment. The storyboard process is the bridge between the written script and the animation that eventually appears on screen. Storyboard artists take the script and translate it into a series of visual panels that show, shot by shot, what each scene will look like. These panels determine camera angles, character positions, and the basic blocking of each scene. They are sent to the overseas animation studios as instructions, and the overseas animators use them as the primary guide for what to draw. This process means that decisions made at the storyboard stage in Los Angeles by people who are physically present and can discuss the creative intent directly have to travel across the world and be interpreted by people who are not present for those conversations. Communication between the Los Angeles production team and the overseas studios happens through detailed notes, reference materials, and regular video calls, but there is still an interpretive gap. Sometimes that gap produces animation that works exactly as intended. Sometimes it produces something slightly off a character whose expression does not quite match the emotional register of the scene, a movement that feels mechanical rather than organic, a visual joke that loses something in translation. One thing that most Family Guy viewers never consciously notice is that the show maintains a specific color palette that is consistent across the show's entire run, despite changing animation studios. The specific shades of yellow, blue, and green that characterize the Griffin home's interior, the specific color of Peter's skin and clothing, the precise blue of Brian's fur, these are standardized across all studios and all seasons through what are called style guides. Detailed documents that specify the exact color values to be used for every recurring character and location. This consistency is one of the production team's most significant ongoing achievements, because maintaining color consistency across multiple studios operating in different countries, with different monitor calibrations and different printing processes, is genuinely difficult work. The chicken fights, the elaborately choreographed action sequences between Peter and Ernie the Giant Chicken that have appeared in various episodes across the show's run, represent the show's most ambitious animation undertakings. Each new chicken fight is intended to be more elaborate and more cinematically referenced than the previous one. The storyboard artists and animation directors treat these sequences as opportunities to parody specific action film styles and cinematographic techniques. Individual chicken fights have referenced the visual language of martial arts films, Michael Bay-style action blockbusters, and classic Hollywood stunt choreography. The animation studios that handle these sequences are given considerably more detailed direction than for standard scenes, and the sequences are often farmed to specific animators within the overseas studios who have demonstrated particular skill with action choreography. The show's background art, the buildings, interiors, and exterior environments that form the visual context for each scene receives less attention from viewers than the character animation, but involves a significant amount of original creative work. Every major recurring location in the show, the Griffin House, the Drunken Clam, the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, James Woods Regional High School, has been painted as original artwork that is adapted and reused across episodes. The visual design of the Griffin House interior in particular was established in the earliest episodes and has remained remarkably consistent across 2 decades. The same yellow walls, the same furniture arrangement, the same staircase. If you watch an episode from Season 1 and an episode from Season 24 back-to-back, the Griffin living room looks essentially the same, which is a quiet achievement in production design consistency. Number. Section 9. Hidden jokes, Easter eggs, and long game callbacks. Family Guy is a show that rewards obsessive attention. The surface of any given episode is full of jokes that land immediately, cutaway gags that are over in seconds, and references that the show assumes most of its audience will catch without effort. But underneath that surface, scattered through the show across its entire run, is a second layer of material. Hidden jokes, visual gags that require pausing the frame, callbacks to moments from episodes years earlier, and deliberate internal references that function as the writing staff, essentially leaving messages for the most devoted segment of their viewership. Start with the background details. Family Guy's background artists regularly insert text, signs, images, and visual jokes into scenes that are on screen for only seconds and that most viewers watching at broadcast speed will never see. In the Season 4 episode Model Misbehavior, the Griffin family wins a boat race, and their victory is covered in the local newspaper. If you freeze the frame on Lois holding up the paper, there is a secondary headline visible in the lower corner that constitutes a complete independent joke, one that has nothing to do with the episode's story. This kind of thing is scattered throughout the show's run. Background signs with punchlines that require a pause to read, newspaper headlines with jokes tucked into the text, graffiti on walls in the background of scenes that says things nobody watching in real time would ever catch. The Blue Harvest episode, the Star Wars parody that aired in Season 6, contains one of the show's most generous Easter egg sequences. During the cantina scene, in which Chris Griffin's character Chris Solo enters a bar full of alien patrons, the background is filled with cameos from other animated shows. Bender from Futurama is visible at the bar. Roger the alien from American Dad is there. Coach John McGuirk from the Cartoon Network series Home Movies appears in the background. The Evil Monkey, a recurring Family Guy gag character who lives in Chris's closet, is also present. This is the show demonstrating that it understands itself as part of a larger ecosystem of animated comedy, and that the people making it are aware of and interested in that ecosystem. The Simpsons crossover episode from Season 13, titled The Simpsons Guy, contains numerous visual jokes that operate on multiple levels simultaneously. When Homer and Peter engage in their own version of the chicken fight, Homer throws Emmy awards at Peter, who has none to throw back. This is a straightforward joke about The Simpsons' extensive awards history relative to Family Guy's The Simpsons has won the Outstanding Animated Series Emmy many times, while Family Guy has not. But there is a second layer. When Roger from American Dad appears briefly in the crossover and then immediately leaves, his exit is accompanied by a note that he is no longer on Fox, which is a reference to the fact that American Dad had by that point moved from Fox to TBS. The show's relationship with its own continuity has produced some genuinely elaborate long-form callbacks. Characters who appear as background figures in early episodes sometimes return as named characters with developed backstories years later. Plots established in one episode and apparently forgotten will occasionally resurface in later seasons, sometimes in ways that suggest the writers always intended to return to them, and sometimes in ways that suggest someone went back through old episodes looking for loose threads to pull. The second category is more common, but the result can feel just as satisfying to attentive viewers as genuinely planned continuity. The Evil Monkey who lives in Chris Griffin's closet is one of the show's most interesting recurring visual gags. The creature appears in brief flashes throughout multiple episodes across several seasons, visible in the background of scenes, pointing at Chris in his characteristic menacing way, without any explanation being offered for what it is or why it is there. It was eventually given a full origin story in the Season 8 episode Hannah Banana, in which the evil monkey turns out to have a real name, a tragic backstory involving a cheating wife, and a desire for genuine human connection that ultimately leads to him befriending Chris. The episode resolved the mystery of the evil monkey in a way that was simultaneously a sincere emotional story and a complete joke about the silliness of having spent years treating this creature as a sinister background element. The Holden Caulfield joke is one that even devoted fans often miss. In an episode where Peter is messing around on a keyboard, a random man who appears nowhere else in the series starts berating him as a phony. The man follows Peter around for the rest of the episode, continuing to call him out for his inauthenticity, and receives no name or explanation. Staff members have referenced this unnamed background character as Holden Caulfield, named after the protagonist of J.D. Salinger's novel The Catcher in the Rye, whose defining personality trait is his contempt for phonies. The joke only fully lands for viewers who both catch the visual detail and make the literary connection, which puts it in the category of material the show produces primarily for its most attentive fraction of the audience. The show's production offices have their own layer of Easter eggs. Inside the building where Family Guy is made, The hallways are lined with props from past episodes, physical objects, and pieces of art from moments in the show's history. Stewie's ray gun. The Pretoria flag from the Season 2 episode where Peter declares his yard a sovereign nation. A "What Really Grinds My Gears" poster. The Banana Brian suit from the episode The Courtship of Stewie's Father. These are not museum pieces. They are working artifacts from a production that is still ongoing, kept around as both decoration and reminder of where the show has been. The Season 10 episode Back to the Pilot is itself a kind of extended Easter egg for longtime viewers. In it, Brian and Stewie use time travel to visit the very first episode of Family Guy Death Has a Shadow and encounter the original versions of the show's characters as they appeared in 1999. The animation style of the original episode is replicated as accurately as possible within the episode's framing story, and the scenes from the pilot are reproduced with enough precision that viewers familiar with the original can spot specific moments being referenced. The episode also includes a meta-joke in which Stewie and Brian observe the characters standing around awkwardly between cutaway gags, which functions as both comedy and as a self-aware acknowledgement of the structural absurdity that critics had been pointing out for years. The Death Has a Shadow pilot episode itself contains material that was recycled from the life of Larry, including the farting scene, which means that if you trace the full genealogy from the life of Larry to the pilot, back to the pilot episode that revisits the pilot, you have a story about a joke that has been told 3 times across a span of 15 years in 3 different forms, each one commenting on and referencing the previous versions. Section 10. The music. A show secretly obsessed with song. Seth MacFarlane is, among other things, a serious musician. This is not a casual interest or a peripheral hobby. He has released 4 studio albums of American jazz standards and big band classics. He has performed at Carnegie Hall. He hosted the Academy Awards in 2013 and opened the ceremony with a musical number. He has collaborated with artists including Tony Bennett and appeared at Las Vegas residencies dedicated to the Great American Songbook. His musical identity is not a side project from his comedy career. It is in many ways the more personal expression of who he is as a creative person. This matters to understanding Family Guy because the show's relationship with music is direct, consistent, and traceable straight back to MacFarlane's personal tastes. Family Guy does not use music the way most animated sitcoms do as background scoring to set emotional tone and then get out of the way. Family Guy uses music as comedy, as storytelling, as character expression, and as a vehicle for the kind of theatrical spectacle that MacFarlane grew up loving and has never stopped loving. The show maintains a live orchestra of 40 to 60 musicians that records original music for every episode. This is an unusual and expensive commitment for a broadcast television comedy in an era when digital music production is both capable and significantly cheaper. MacFarlane insisted on live orchestration because he knows the difference between synthesized music and a real ensemble playing together in a room, and because the emotional quality of the music in the show's big moments requires the kind of warmth and unpredictability that only live performance provides. When Peter and his friends break into a production-quality number in the middle of an episode, it sounds like it was produced by a real orchestra because it was. The show's musical supervisor and longtime composer is Walter Murphy, who has been with Family Guy since the beginning. Murphy wrote the show's main theme, the opening number that plays over the sequence of the Griffin family descending the stairs, and has continued to compose and arrange original music for every episode across the show's entire run. His background in both jazz arranging and theatrical music gives Family Guy's original compositions a quality that is distinctive within the animated comedy landscape. MacFarlane wrote the show's theme himself. He has spoken about fighting with network executives at Fox to keep the theme intact. The network's preference, in the early days, was for something shorter and less elaborate, a brief musical sting that got the show started as quickly as possible and did not ask viewers to sit through a production number before the episode began. MacFarlane held out for the full theme, arguing that the theatrical quality of the opening sequence established the show's sensibility in a way that a brief sting could not. He won the argument, and the theme, with its explicit Broadway-style choreography and its jazz orchestra underpinning, became one of the most recognizable pieces of original music in animated television history. It was nominated for an Annie Award in 2000, in the first year of the show's existence. The Road to episodes, the special Brian and Stewie adventure episodes that began with Road to Rhode Island in Season 2 and have continued periodically throughout the show's run, function as the show's Primary Musical Theater Showcase. Each Road 2 episode contains multiple original songs and production numbers, and they are consciously designed in tribute to the Bing Crosby and Bob Hope Road 2 films of the 1940s. MacFarlane's love of that particular era of Hollywood musical entertainment, Crosby, Hope, and the leading ladies who kept getting caught between them, is transparent in every Road 2 episode. And the care with which the songs are written and performed in these specials is noticeably higher than in standard episodes. The FCC song from the Season 4 episode PTV is considered by many fans and by the show's own production staff to be the single best original song in Family Guy's history. It is a parody of the Broadway number, The Volunteer Organist, a comedic song written for the stage musical Take Me Along, and it was performed as the centerpiece of an episode about censorship. The song lists everything that the Federal Communications Commission objected to in broadcast television content while simultaneously performing as many of those things on screen as possible. The animation that accompanies the song is densely packed with visual gags and references that reward multiple viewings. MacFarlane performed an extended version of the song at the 2007 Emmy Awards, bringing the joke from a network that had been fined by the FCC to the network television industry's most prestigious annual celebration. The real FCC, upon seeing the song, reportedly expressed genuine appreciation for it. MacFarlane has mentioned this in interviews as one of the stranger professional experiences of his career, creating a piece of content specifically designed to mock a regulatory body, and having that regulatory body respond with what appeared to be genuine good humor. Within the logic of the episode, Peter's reaction to learning that the FCC enjoyed his song was extreme anger. My Drunken Irish Dad, which appeared in the Season 4 episode Peter's Two Dads, is a song that MacFarlane performed as both characters Peter and his biological father, Mickey McFinnigan, essentially singing an entire musical duet with himself. The song was nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Music and Lyrics in 2007, which was a serious recognition of the quality of the musical work being done in what was technically a comedy show. The nomination also underscored how seriously the show's production team took the musical aspects of the program. The Prom Night Dumpster Baby song is one of the more genuinely dark musical moments in the show's history. It appeared in a Season 8 episode and featured an elaborately choreographed production number built around the image of babies abandoned in trash receptacles, complete with a upbeat, almost cheerfully morbid melody and a dancing cast of the kind of babies the song described. The tonal dissonance between the subject matter and the presentation is entirely deliberate and entirely characteristic of the show at a certain creative peak. MacFarlane has spoken about how musical comedy can allow material to go places that straight comedy cannot, because the theatrical framing signals to the audience that they are watching a performance, rather than being asked to genuinely feel something about the subject matter. MacFarlane's bass baritone singing voice, which is the voice that appears on his 4 studio albums, is distinct from any of the character voices he performs on Family Guy. But traces of it appear in the show regularly, and the genuine skill of the singing performance in the show's big musical numbers is something that catches many viewers off guard. The expectation going in is that an animated character singing will be processed and adjusted into something broadly palatable. The reality is often considerably more sophisticated than that, because the person singing it actually trained in musical theater and can hit the notes being asked for without electronic assistance. The Stewie Griffin, the untold story direct-to-video film that was released in 2005, contained extended versions of material that had originally appeared in 3 Season 4 episodes. With additional scenes added, the film's release on DVD allowed for content that could not air on broadcast television, more explicit language, more extreme visual content, and it served as both a product for fans and a demonstration of what the show could do when freed from broadcast standards restrictions. The film's structure around 3 separate but thematically connected stories also demonstrated that the Family Guy production team could sustain a longer narrative form when given the space to do so. The music in Family Guy has been consistently praised, even in critical appraisals of the show that were otherwise mixed or negative. This is significant, because it suggests that the musical element represents an area of the show where the creative standards were maintained regardless of what was happening with the writing or character development in other areas. The orchestra kept playing. The songs kept being produced with genuine craft. Whatever else was happening with Peter Griffin or Brian Griffin in any given season, the music remained a consistent area of genuine creative investment. Number. Section 11. the deaths, near deaths, and cast departures. Every long-running show accumulates loss. The people who create it, perform in it, and shape its identity across years and decades are human, and they age, and they move on, and sometimes they die. Family Guy has been running long enough that it has experienced all of these things in real and significant ways, and the manner in which the show has responded to each has both affected the product and revealed something about the priorities of the people making it. Brian Griffin's death in Season 12's Life of Brian is the most discussed event in the show's long history of treating important things as temporary. The episode aired on the 24th of November, 2013. Brian was struck by a car in the driveway of the Griffin home and died from his injuries. The Griffin family mourned him. A new dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico, then known primarily for playing Paulie Walnuts in The Sopranos, was introduced as his replacement. The episode was treated with emotional seriousness within its own structure, and reactions from the audience were significant enough to generate national news coverage and sustained social media discussion. 2 episodes later, the Christmas episode Christmas Guy aired and undid everything. Stewie used a stolen time travel device to return to the moment before Brian was hit by the car and prevent the accident. Brian came back to life. Everything was restored. The internet, which had been loudly and emotionally invested in Brian's death, became loudly and emotionally invested in Fox and MacFarlane for what fans perceived as a cheap rating stunt kill the dog, let people process the grief, bring him back before the emotional investment had time to harden into permanent change. MacFarlane has said in subsequent interviews that Brian's death was always intended to be temporary, and that the point of the arc was not to permanently alter the show but to demonstrate, through his absence and return, how important the character was to the show's identity. Whether that framing is accurate or was developed after the fact to explain a rating strategy is something that only the people in the room during those production discussions would know. What is not in dispute is that Brian's return generated as much discussion as his death, and that the entire arc substantially boosted the show's viewership and social media presence during a period when both were declining. The death of Adam West in 2017 was different, real, permanent, and handled by the show with evident affection. Adam West had voiced Mayor Adam West on Family Guy since the show's early seasons, and the character had become one of the show's most beloved recurring presences precisely because of how fully West inhabited the role's particular absurdity. An episode titled Adam West High aired in October of 2017 as a tribute to the actor. The episode was dedicated to his memory and included material that allowed the other characters to acknowledge the loss of the mayor in terms that operated on both the fictional and real levels simultaneously. It was one of the show's more genuinely moving hours. Carrie Fisher, who had guest-voiced a recurring character named Angela on American Dad and had made appearances in Family Guy, died in December of 2016. Her passing was acknowledged in both shows, though the logistics of writing out or acknowledging the loss of a recurring voice character presented practical challenges that the shows navigated in different ways. The departure of Mike Henry from voicing the character Cleveland Brown was handled publicly and with more fanfare than most cast changes in the show's history. Henry, who is white, had voiced Cleveland, who is black, since the show's beginning in 1999. In 2020, following widespread public discussion about the appropriateness of non-black actors voicing black characters in animation, Henry publicly announced that he would be stepping away from the role. He posted on social media that it was time for the character to be voiced by a black actor, and that he was grateful for the years he had spent with the character, but understood that the landscape had changed. The role was subsequently taken over by Arif Zahir, a black actor and comedian who had gained online recognition for his YouTube videos, including Family Guy-related content. Zahir's transition into the role was handled without a formal in-show acknowledgement. Cleveland sounded different from one episode to the next without the narrative ever addressing it, which is how most voice cast changes in animation are typically managed. Henry's departure from Cleveland Brown did not affect his involvement with Family Guy more broadly. He continues to voice several other recurring characters, including Herbert, the show's elderly neighbor whose uncomfortable interest in Chris is one of the show's more deliberately dark recurring gags, and Consuela, the Spanish-speaking cleaning woman who has appeared in numerous episodes. Herbert is one of the more unusual choices the show has sustained. A character who exists in a space where comedy and genuine discomfort coexist in ways the show has never attempted to resolve or explain. The voice transition on the character Cleveland had a specific production implication. Cleveland had been the subject of his own spin-off series, The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013 on Fox. Henry voiced Cleveland across that entire run. When the character returned to Family Guy following The Cleveland Show's cancellation, Henry resumed the role in the parent show. The Zahir transition therefore affected not just Family Guy but the legacy of a character who had sustained his own program for 4 seasons. Patrick Warburton has continued to voice Joe Swanson across the show's entire run, making him one of the longest continuously tenured members of the cast. His longevity is particularly notable because Joe is not one of the show's most prominent characters in terms of screen time. He is a recurring, supporting presence rather than a lead. Warburton's commitment to a role that does not always give him the most material to work with reflects something about the professional culture of the show's long-term cast members, who have mostly stayed even as the show has changed around them. Seth Green's continued work as Chris Griffin across the show's entire run is similarly consistent. Green has had a parallel career as an on-screen actor and as the creator and host of the stop-motion comedy program Robot Chicken, which has occasionally overlapped with the Family Guy universe through crossovers and mutual references. His vocal work on Chris has remained consistent even as the character's role in the show has shifted over the seasons. Number Section 12. The Legacy, the Numbers, and What Comes Next. Family Guy has been on television for more than 25 years. It has produced more than 400 episodes. It has been canceled twice and revived twice. It has been nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Comedy Series, the first animated show to receive that nomination since The Flintstones in 1961. It has been ranked by TV Guide among the greatest television cartoons ever made. It has generated merchandise, video games, spin-off series, direct-to-video films, theme park attractions, and an ecosystem of related content that extends far beyond the broadcast episodes. It has made Seth MacFarlane extraordinarily wealthy and has funded environmental causes through organizations like Rainforest Trust that MacFarlane has cited as among the more meaningful things the show has enabled. By the numbers, Family Guy's reach across its history is genuinely difficult to comprehend in full. The show's first episode reached 22 million viewers in a single broadcast. The most recent seasons have averaged less than 1 million viewers for new episodes. That decline in broadcast viewership is real and significant, but it also does not capture the full picture of how the show is consumed. Family Guy is one of the most streamed animated shows available, with episodes regularly appearing in viewership data for both Hulu, where the show has its exclusive streaming home in the United States, and the various cable networks that continue to air reruns. The way people watch television has changed so dramatically over the show's run that raw broadcast numbers are increasingly incomplete as a measure of cultural relevance. In January 2023, Fox renewed the show for its 22nd and 23rd seasons. And in April 2025, a new deal was announced, a massive multi-season commitment that extended the show through season 27 and the 2028 to 2029 television season, which will coincide with the show's 30th anniversary. Each season under the new deal consists of 15 episodes, down from the longer runs the show sometimes produced in its peak years. The financial structure of that deal was described in reports as involving the parent company Disney, which had acquired Fox's entertainment assets and therefore controls the show's future. That Disney ownership is one of the stranger facts in the show's current existence. Family Guy, a show that has spent 25 years satirizing exactly the kind of corporate media consolidation that Disney represents. A show that has made jokes at Disney's expense specifically. A show that has never been mistaken for family-friendly content is now a Disney property. The Simpsons is in the same situation. American Dad likewise. The empire that acquired them all has characteristics that are almost precisely opposed to the sensibility those shows embody. The business logic is sound. The cultural irony is enormous. MacFarlane's 2024 interview about the show's future framed its continuation primarily in terms of financial utility and audience demand. He spoke about the show having reached what he called escape velocity, a point where it has been running long enough that there is no logical narrative reason to stop it unless the audience stops caring. He mentioned that the revenue the show generates funds causes he cares about. He did not speak about exciting new stories he wanted to tell with these characters, or creative directions he was eager to explore, or things about the show that still genuinely excited him. The framing was of a man who has made his peace with a show continuing to exist because it can continue to exist, and who finds ways to feel good about that reality. This is honestly one of the most human things about the Family Guy story at this point. A young man from Connecticut had an idea for a cartoon when he was in college, and through a combination of talent, persistence, and extraordinary luck, including the luck of missing a plane that crashed into a skyscraper, he built that idea into something that has been a presence in American popular culture for more than a quarter century. The young man became middle-aged. The show changed around him, sometimes in ways he directed and sometimes in ways he watched from a distance. It became something different from what it started as, and he has made a kind of peace with that difference that is probably the only psychologically manageable response to the situation. The show's Emmy nomination in 2009 is worth examining in the context of what came after. The Outstanding Comedy Series nomination for an animated program, the first since The Flintstones, was a recognition that Family Guy had, at that point in its history, earned consideration alongside the best live-action comedies on television. It was treated as historic by the people who cared about such things, and it was historic. It also turned out to be a high watermark that the show would not reach again in terms of critical esteem, even as it continued to produce episodes and continued to be watched by millions of people. The show's move from Sunday nights to Wednesday nights in the 2023 to 2024 broadcast season was the kind of scheduling demotion that the television industry reads clearly, even when it does not announce itself. Clearly, Sunday nights on Fox, in the animation domination block, had been Family Guy's home for the vast majority of its existence. Being moved to a weekday was a statement, not necessarily a final statement, but a statement about where the network ranked the show's importance relative to the primetime real estate it was being asked to occupy. The spin-offs that Family Guy generated are their own chapter in the show's legacy. The Cleveland Show ran for 4 seasons before being canceled. American Dad continues to this day, having made a graceful transition from Fox to TBS and establishing itself as, in the opinion of many fans and critics, a show that surpassed its parent in creative quality even as it received a fraction of the cultural attention. The Cleveland Show is largely forgotten. American Dad has built a devoted audience that appreciates its more character-driven approach and its refusal to use cutaway gags as a structural crutch. A Stewie-focused project has been announced. As of the writing of this script, Stewie titled simply that is scheduled for release in 2027 or 2028. The project represents a bet that the character can sustain his own dedicated narrative outside the Family Guy format, and it reflects the ongoing commercial and creative investment in a character whose original design, the evil baby, was retired by the show years ago, but whose recognition value remains among the highest of any animated character of his generation. What comes after that is genuinely unknown, which is perhaps the most honest thing you can say about a show that has defied prediction at every stage of its existence. It was canceled and came back. It was canceled again and came back again. It has outlasted most of the cultural moment that produced it, and continued to find ways to be relevant, or at least to continue existing, in cultural moments it did not anticipate. The characters who started as fresh inventions are now familiar to multiple generations of viewers in different ways. Peter Griffin is known by people who have never sat down and watched a full episode of Family Guy, in the same way that Bugs Bunny and Homer Simpson are known by people who have no particular investment in the shows that produce them. That is the definition of cultural penetration, and whatever else you say about Family Guy, it has achieved it. The most interesting question about the show's future is not whether it will continue the renewal deal, makes that essentially certain through the end of the decade. The most interesting question is whether the show, at some point in the years ahead, will find its way back to something that resembles what it once was. Whether the writing staff will discover, or rediscover, the particular combination of warmth and irreverence, and genuine character investment that made the first few seasons feel like something genuinely new. Whether the characters who have drifted from their original selves will find their way back, partially or fully, to something that viewers who fell in love with them in 1999 would recognize. The evidence from the show's history is mixed on this question. There are episodes from later seasons that demonstrate conclusively that the capability is still there. Episodes where the writing is sharp, where the characters feel like themselves, where the joke lands and also means something. Those episodes are not common enough to define the later seasons, but they are common enough to suggest that the talent and the possibility still exist. Brian and Stewie locked in a bank vault talking honestly about their fears, and their friendship is evidence that this show can be something extraordinary when it commits to being extraordinary. The question is whether it will commit more often. Family Guy began as the vision of one person who had a very specific idea of what he wanted to create and spent years building the skills to create it. It became a collaborative enterprise in which that original vision was filtered through many other people's sensibilities, shaped by network demands and legal constraints and audience preferences and production economics, and the gradual attrition of the original team that built it. This is the story of almost every long-running creative work. It is a story without a clean ending, because the work is still ongoing, and the people making it are still making decisions that will determine what it eventually becomes. What is certain is that the show matters enough to people for this conversation to be worth having. You are here, watching this, because Family Guy is part of your cultural landscape in some way, whether you love it, whether you have complicated feelings about it, whether you are curious about the parts you never knew. That interest is the thing that the original creators built, and that the show at its best continues to justify. 25 years of any creative work accumulates a kind of weight. The weight of all the choices that were made, all the jokes that were told, all the characters who were built and changed and sometimes diminished and occasionally restored. Family Guy carries that weight now, across more than 400 episodes and 2 cancellations and a revival and a cultural moment that has changed many times around it while the show kept going. It is imperfect in ways that are specific and traceable, and often frustrating to the people who love it most. It is also remarkable in ways that deserve acknowledgement. It is still here, still producing, still being watched, still occasionally doing something that reminds you of what it once was and what it still could be. The man who missed that flight in September of 2001, who had to be told by a bartender what had happened to the plane he was supposed to be on, went home that day and eventually went back to the writer's room and kept making this show. The security guard at RISD, whose voice became Peter Griffin, will presumably never know the scale of what those overheard sentences produced. The professor who submitted a student thesis film to an animation studio on a hunch about its author's potential will have spent decades watching where that hunch led. Family Guy is all of those things simultaneously: the student film and the primetime hit, and the cultural institution and the product that outlasted its creator's full creative investment. Understanding all of those things together is understanding something true about how creative works actually come into the world and what happens to them after they arrive. If you made it this far, thank you genuinely. This was a long journey through a show that deserves the attention. If you enjoyed it, hit the like button and consider subscribing. There is a lot more where this came from, and every single subscriber makes these videos possible. Tell me in the comments what surprised you most from everything we covered today. I read every comment, and some of your responses become the starting point for the next video. Until then, take it easy. End of script. Number. Supplemental Section A. The Stewie Griffin Files. What the show never told you directly. There is a detail about Stewie Griffin's physical appearance that the show tucked away in a brief flashback during Season 3, and that most viewers have entirely forgotten about. Stewie was not born with his distinctive, football-shaped head. In the Season 3 episode Stuck Together, Torn Apart, a flashback reveals that baby Stewie had a normal, round head at birth. The unusual elongated head shape, which is one of the character's most visually distinctive features, was the result of an accident involving his parents' bed. This is such an absurd and specific piece of character backstory that it almost seems like a joke that was pitched in the writer's room as an explanation for something nobody had thought to question, and then made it into an episode because it was funnier than not including it. Stewie's birthday is established in the show's continuity as the 11th of September, 1998. This is a date that the show did not draw particular attention to. It is tucked into background material and official documents rather than being highlighted in any episode, but it sits there in the character's profile as one of those details that the writers either included deliberately as a very dark joke, included without realizing the implication, or established before the date acquired its current permanent cultural weight and simply never changed. The character's age has remained essentially frozen at 1 year old for the entirety of the show's run, with only one significant exception. In the episode Life of Brian 2, Revival Reversal, Stewie celebrated his 2nd birthday. Given that the show premiered in 1999 and that episode aired approximately 15 years into the show's run, the gap between those 2 birthdays represents one of the longest periods between anniversaries in television history. The show's explanation for why other characters apparently cannot understand Stewie, why his elaborate plans and murderous monologues and sophisticated complaints appear to register to the adults around him as nothing more than Baby babble is something that shifted over the course of the series. In the very earliest episodes, it was established fairly clearly that most people literally could not understand what Stewie was saying. He existed in a state of comprehensive adult indifference to what he was actually communicating, which was part of the comedy. Brian was the notable exception, the one member of the household who could genuinely converse with Stewie, which established their relationship as built on a foundation of mutual comprehension in a world of incomprehension. As the show progressed, this rule was applied inconsistently. Other characters sometimes seemed to understand Stewie perfectly. Conversations between Stewie and characters other than Brian sometimes proceeded without any indication that there was a communication barrier. The show gradually drifted away from committing to the only Brian can understand him premise because enforcing it consistently across every scene in every episode was creatively limiting. But the early season's commitment to that rule gave Stewie a specific loneliness that made his relationship with Brian more moving and his isolation more real. One of the facts about Stewie that the show established and then essentially never used again is that he caused the Big Bang. In a time travel episode, a series of cascading accidents involving his time machine ultimately resulted in Stewie inadvertently triggering the origin of the universe. This was played as an absurdist joke in the moment the baby trying to dominate a world he accidentally created, and the show moved on from it without addressing the philosophical implications of what had just been established. But it is technically canonical within the show's universe that Stewie Griffin is responsible for the existence of all matter, energy, space, and time. That is, objectively, the most consequential character backstory in animated television history. Stewie's time machine has been one of the show's most narratively useful devices, employed in more than a dozen episodes across the show's run for a variety of plot purposes. What is interesting about the time machine as a storytelling tool is what it reveals about the show's relationship with consequences. In a show that repeatedly uses resets, moments where something dramatic happens and is then undone through a convenient in-universe mechanism, the time machine is the most honest version of that habit. It does not pretend the reset happened off-screen or through some vague handwave. It explicitly shows the mechanism by which the dramatic event is reversed. Brian's death in Life of Brian is the most famous example, but there are smaller versions of this scattered throughout the show's run. Situations where the potential consequences of an episode's events are avoided through the explicit use of technology that the characters in this universe happen to possess. The football-shaped head has been referenced in crossover material in ways that speak to how recognizable it has become as a visual shorthand. When Family Guy appeared in Fox's marketing campaigns and cross-promotional material, Stewie's silhouette, the head shape, the yellow shirt, the football head was sufficient to identify the character without any other detail. This is a remarkable level of visual brand recognition for a character who is, technically, an infant dressed like a 1950s prep school student plotting global domination. Number. Supplemental Section B. The giant chicken, the recurring gags, and the jokes that became legends. Some of the most discussed elements of Family Guy's creative legacy are not plot arcs or character development or controversial episodes. They are recurring gags jokes that the show returned to repeatedly, sometimes across many seasons, in ways that transformed them from one-off bits into something closer to traditions. Understanding the history and structure of these recurring elements reveals something about how the show thinks about comedy and about its own identity. The giant chicken fights, as discussed in an earlier section, began in the Season 2 episode Da Boom as a brief gag about escalating grievance. Peter has an altercation with a giant chicken named Ernie over an expired coupon. The altercation escalates into an elaborate fight sequence that goes on far longer than any rational story logic would dictate. The length itself was the joke. The fight ran through multiple environments, involved elaborate stunt choreography, destroyed property at an increasingly implausible scale, and ended with Peter and Ernie both exhausted and apparently equally committed to continuing this pointless conflict. The writers returned to the chicken fight format repeatedly, each time raising the scale and the cinematographic ambition. The fifth chicken fight, which aired in the Season 10 episode Internal Affairs, was produced with reference to specific action films and contained visual homages that animation enthusiasts have cataloged in some detail. The show has now produced 7 or 8 chicken fights, depending on how you count brief encounters versus full sequences, and each one is treated as a production event requiring more planning and more detailed direction than a standard scene. What is interesting about the chicken fight as a recurring gag is that it functions on two levels simultaneously. On the surface, it is a physical comedy bit about a man fighting a giant chicken in an increasingly ridiculous situation. Underneath that, it is a commentary on escalation itself, on how human beings take minor grievances and invest them with totally disproportionate energy and consequence. The chicken fight is funny, but it is also a very specific kind of funny that the show chose to make the signature of one of its most recognizable visual traditions. Conway Twitty was a real American country singer who recorded hits throughout the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. He died in 1993. Family Guy began using footage of his musical performances as a recurring cutaway gag in Season 7. The gag operated on a single principle. Instead of a joke, the show would simply cut to an unedited Conway Twitty performance that would play in its entirety before cutting back to the main story. No commentary. No punchline. Just Conway Twitty singing one of his songs. The first time this gag appeared, it was genuinely surprising. The element of pure, prolonged non sequitur, the show stopping to show you a country music performance for absolutely no stated reason, was unexpected enough to be funny through sheer disorientation. The second and third appearances of the Conway Twitty gag were progressively less surprising and progressively more likely to provoke the specific kind of laughter that comes from recognizing a recurring bit that you know the show has committed to unconditionally. By the time Conway Twitty had appeared several times, the gag had become one of the more openly divisive elements in the show's history. Fans who found the sheer commitment funny loved it. Fans who expected their comedy to be, in some minimum sense, comedic found it frustrating. MacFarlane and the writers have been fairly candid about the fact that the Conway Twitty gag was specifically designed to test how far audiences would accept the show pushing into pure anti-comedy territory. It was, in a sense, the show doing something formally interesting, using the cutaway format to subvert the cutaway format, and whether you found it funny or infuriating probably depended on whether you had the context to recognize what it was doing. The Surfin' Bird gag, in which Peter becomes obsessed with the 1963 song Bird is the Word by the Trashmen and plays it at full volume on repeat, while his family tries to stop him, is one of the most memorable episodes of the show's middle period. The Season 7 episode I Dream of Jesus featured this bit as its central joke, and the episode's commitment to the bit was total. For a significant portion of the runtime, the show essentially was Peter playing Bird is the Word, very loudly, with his family's frustrated reactions at la route. The gag became an internet phenomenon before the word internet phenomenon was particularly common, and Bird is the Word enjoyed a genuine, measurable cultural revival as a result of the episode's popularity. The What Really Grinds My Gears segment's brief monologues delivered by Peter as a cable news commentator began in Season 4 and appeared with varying frequency across subsequent seasons. The segments allowed the writers to deploy a specific kind of observational complaint humor that did not always fit naturally into the episode's main plot, and they gave MacFarlane an opportunity to do a particular kind of comedy that drew on his affection for old-school television commentary formats. The segments are set up exactly like news commentary: graphic over Peter's shoulder, camera angle, the specific self-important tone of someone who has been given a microphone and decided this means their opinions are important. The joke is that Peter's grinding gears are invariably trivial, personal, and delivered with the same gravitas that the format usually reserves for genuinely significant social observations. Number, supplemental section. C. The Quagmire Files, one of television's most complicated characters. Glenn Quagmire is one of the most unusual characters in Family Guy's long history, and not because he is the most developed or the most emotionally complex. He is unusual because the show has always seemed genuinely uncertain what to do with him, and that uncertainty has produced a character whose depiction oscillates between celebration, condemnation, and careful avoidance in ways that do not always add up to a coherent portrait. In the first few seasons, Quagmire was presented as a character whose persistent sexual pursuit of women, often pursued through methods that, examined directly, are somewhere between aggressive and actively dangerous, was played as a comedy archetype. The swinger neighbor. The guy who hit on every woman in every room. His giggity catchphrase became one of the show's most quoted lines, which created a situation where a piece of dialogue associated with predatory behavior toward women became a nationwide pop culture reference that people said to each other as a friendly greeting. The show has occasionally grappled with this dynamic more directly than it usually does. The Quagmire's Dad episode, in which Quagmire's parent is revealed to have transitioned to female, was one of the more controversial episodes in the show's history, criticized widely for handling the transgender subject matter in ways that were perceived as mockery rather than understanding. Seth MacFarlane later expressed regret about aspects of how that episode was written, which is one of the relatively rare instances of the show's creator publicly acknowledging that something did not land the way it was intended. What is less discussed is Quagmire's range as a character in other directions. He has episodes that reveal genuine depth, his protectiveness of his sister in the domestic violence episode Screams of Silence, for instance, demonstrated that the writers knew how to use him in ways that were more than comedic. The tension between Quagmire as comic archetype and Quagmire as actual character has never been resolved, which means he exists in a permanent state of creative ambiguity. His speech against Brian in the Season 8 episode Jerome is the New Black is one of the show's most quoted monologues, and worth examining in detail because of what it reveals about the show's self-awareness at a particular moment. Quagmire, who is not typically the show's moral voice, delivers a precise and devastating assessment of Brian's character. The pretension, the hypocrisy, the abandoned son, the failed writing career, the continuous pursuit of Lois in front of Peter, everything he says is accurate. The show knew Brian had become a difficult character to like, and it put that knowledge into the mouth of a character who, by any objective standard, should be the last person delivering moral judgments. This creates an interesting formal situation. A character who has done genuinely problematic things throughout the show's run is being used to deliver a critique that the show clearly agrees with, which means the audience is being asked to accept the critique as valid, while also accepting that the person delivering it is not a model of good behavior. The show threads this needle by essentially suggesting that you do not have to be virtuous to be right about another person's flaws. Quagmire may not be a good man, but his assessment of Brian is correct. The season in question did not follow up on that critique in any sustained way, which meant that the speech functioned as a form of audience service. Here is the thing you have been thinking about Brian, expressed precisely rather than as a genuine turning point in either character's arc. Quagmire is technically, within the show's stated continuity, significantly older than he appears. The driver's license gag that revealed his age as 61 was a one-off joke that the show never fully committed to or fully abandoned. It exists in the same liminal space as much of Family Guy's internal continuity, true when the show needs it to be true, ignored when the show needs to move past it. His catchphrase, giggity, has a specific evolution within the show that is rarely examined. It began as a relatively rare verbal tic, something Quagmire said in moments of sexual anticipation, and became over the seasons increasingly divorced from any specific context, used as a general-purpose expression of approval or excitement, regardless of whether the situation warranted it. The inflation of the catchphrase from occasional character detail to near-constant verbal signature is itself a kind of miniature Flanderization, the one trait that the audience responded to, being expanded until it threatened to swallow everything else about the character. Number supplemental section. D. The Lois Griffin problem. The character the show forgot how to write. There is a particular kind of fate that befalls the female anchors of male-centered family comedies. They begin as complex people, loving but firm, patient but principled, capable of their own interests and desires, and they slowly are reduced to functional roles. The nag who disapproves, the voice of reason who goes unheard, the object of the male lead's affection whose interior life becomes progressively less important as the show ages. Lois Griffin experienced this trajectory with particular speed and particular thoroughness. In the first 3 seasons, Lois was one of the more interesting female characters in animated comedy. She was a classically trained pianist. She had a complicated family history, the wealthy Pewterschmidt background, the brother who turned out to be a serial killer, the suggestion that she had been a rebellious and independent person before settling into the role of Peter's wife. She made actual decisions that affected the show's plots. She had opinions that the narrative took seriously. She was also, subtly, a person with her own capacity for moral ambiguity. The revelation that she had been a shoplifter in her youth, enjoying the thrill of theft in ways that contradicted her conventional suburban homemaker persona, was one of those character details that added a layer of complexity, without undermining her fundamental goodness. She was capable of being wrong, of wanting things she should not want, of making choices that were not entirely admirable. That capacity is what made her feel like a person, rather than a function. As the show progressed, Lois became progressively less interesting. Her role calcified into disapproving reactions and occasional expressions of frustrated desire. The show found it easier to use her as a device, Peter's conscience, or counterweight, or the person who explains to the audience what just went wrong, than to develop her as an independent presence. Her moments of genuine agency became rarer, and increasingly tied to episodes that were specifically about her, rather than to the show's general fabric. The moments when the show remembered who Lois was capable of being are worth noting. An episode that revealed her history as a young woman who had fallen briefly into a romantic relationship with Gene Simmons of Kiss demonstrated that the writers still knew there was more to her than Peter's wife. An episode that explored her relationship with her mother and the specific psychological inheritance of being raised in the Pewter-Schmidt household showed that the character's backstory remained available to be mined when the writers chose to mine it. But these were exceptions in a pattern of diminishment that mirrored what was happening to the show's other characters, just with less attention and less discussion. The relationship between Peter and Lois in the early seasons was one of the show's genuine strengths. It was a love story that coexisted with a comedy. They bickered, they frustrated each other, they occasionally embarrassed each other in front of people they cared about, and then they came back together because they actually loved each other, and the love was stronger than the frustration. This is the pattern of a real marriage, not an idealized one, and its specificity was part of what made the early show feel grounded in a way that the later seasons lost. The trajectory of that relationship over the show's run is a gradual cooling. The warmth that was present in the early seasons, the scenes that ended with Peter telling Lois he loved her, the moments where their mutual affection was visible underneath their conflicts, became less frequent. The show seemed to find the affectionate version of their relationship less comedically useful than the conflicted version, and it leaned harder on conflict. This shift is subtle in any individual season, but dramatic when you compare early and late episodes directly. Number. Supplemental Section E. The World. The show built deep lore of a fictional town. Family Guy is set in a fictional town called Quahog, Rhode Island, a name the show's production team chose for reasons that connect back to Seth MacFarlane's time at RISD in Providence, Rhode Island, where he met several people who would go on to be involved with the show. A quahog is a species of hard-shell clam common to the New England coast, which gives the town's name a specific regional flavor that reinforces the show's anchoring in a very particular kind of American geography. Quahog is designed as a mid-sized New England city, small enough that the Griffin's social circle is limited and recurring characters appear with plausible frequency, large enough that Peter can have adventures across a range of different environments without the world feeling impossibly constrained. The show has been inconsistent about the town's specific geography, its relationship to Providence, to Boston, to the coastline because the writers have generally prioritized story logic over cartographic accuracy. Quahog is wherever the episode needs it to be. The town has a recurring set of established locations that function as the show's stage. The Drunken Clam Bar is where Peter and his friends spend most of their social time. The Pawtucket Patriot Brewery is where Peter works. James Woods Regional High School is where the Griffin children nominally attend classes. The Quahog 5 news station where Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons and later others deliver the kind of local television news that the show has always treated as a specific comedy subgenre, appears with great regularity. The Griffin House at 31 Spooner Street is the primary setting. These locations have been rendered with enough consistency that they feel like real places within the show's fictional geography. The Quahog 5 news desk has been the source of some of the show's most reliable comedy. Tom Tucker's combination of vanity, incompetence, and complete indifference to journalistic ethics, the series of female co-anchors who have occupied the seat across the show's various seasons, and the show's recurring joke about the specific way local television news is produced. The character of Tom Tucker, voiced by Seth MacFarlane, is one of those recurring presences that does not get enough credit for how consistently funny he is within the show's established world. His son, Jake Tucker, a recurring background gag in which the child's face is upside down on his head, is one of the stranger visual jokes in the show's catalog, maintained across multiple seasons with complete commitment to a bit that defies any rational explanation. Ollie Williams, the show's African-American weatherman, whose weather reports consist entirely of single brief sentences, "It's gone rain," is one of the great recurring minor characters in the show's history. Voiced by Phil Lamar, who has had one of the more impressive careers in voice acting of any performer, who is not primarily known for voice work, Ollie's segments are among the most compressed comedy bits in a show that makes frequent use of brief, punchy gags. The joke is the format. A weather report that contains all necessary information in roughly 4 words, delivered with the confidence of someone who has given the most thorough briefing possible. The evil monkey's closet was located in Chris's bedroom, and the eventual resolution of that story in the Season 8 episode, Hannah Banana, gave the creature a name, James, and a full backstory that explained his presence in the house. After becoming friends with Chris, James moved out and was last seen pursuing a more emotionally fulfilled existence somewhere outside the Griffin home. This resolution was satisfying in the specific way that Family Guy resolutions can be satisfying when the show commits to them. Completely absurd in its details, unexpectedly touching in its emotional logic. Number. Supplemental Section F. The Simpsons Rivalry. The relationship nobody talks about, honestly. Family Guy has existed in the shadow of The Simpsons since its premiere, and the relationship between the two shows is one of the more interesting dynamics in the history of American animated comedy. It is not simply a rivalry in the competitive sense, though it is that too. It is also a relationship built on mutual influence, mutual irritation, and a certain amount of mutual recognition that runs underneath the public posturing in both directions. When Family Guy premiered in 1999, it was immediately compared to The Simpsons by critics who had limited vocabulary for adult animation that was not The Simpsons. The comparisons were not entirely unfair. Both shows followed a dysfunctional American family. Both used an animated format to do comedy that would have been impossible in live action. Both had a satirical relationship with American culture, but they obscured the significant differences in approach, humor, and sensibility between the two programs. The Simpsons writing staff's relationship with Family Guy has been described in various places as containing a degree of competitive displeasure that is stronger than the public statements from either side would suggest. When South Park ran Cartoon Wars in 2006, the 2-part episode that directly attacked Family Guy's creative approach, Trey Parker reportedly received congratulatory messages from writers at The Simpsons, thanking him for making those episodes. The behind-the-scenes communications described in published accounts suggest that The Simpsons team had been frustrated by Family Guy's success and by what they perceived as Family Guy borrowing from a format they had established, and that the South Park criticism gave voice to things they had been thinking but could not say publicly without appearing petty. The actual crossover between the two shows, The Simpsons Guy, which aired as a Season 13 episode of Family Guy, was one of the more remarkable events in the history of American animation. The two most successful animated family sitcoms in the medium's history spent 45 minutes in the same fictional space, interacting directly. The episode was produced by the Family Guy team and watched with enormous interest by fans of both shows. What is interesting about how that crossover was constructed is the degree to which it acknowledged the rivalry explicitly rather than pretending it did not exist. The fight between Peter and Homer, which mirrored the chicken fight format and lasted significantly longer than any narrative logic required, was a direct representation of the competitive relationship between the two shows. Homer hurling Emmy Awards at Peter, who had none to return, was the most direct possible statement of the critical and industry establishment's long-standing preference for The Simpsons. The episode did not pretend the shows were equals in terms of cultural standing. It acknowledged the hierarchy and made the acknowledgement funny. The shared creative DNA between the two shows goes deeper than either would entirely admit. Both emerged from a tradition of American animated comedy that treated the family sitcom format as material to be satirized rather than celebrated. Both used a specific kind of celebrity cameo, the unexpected guest voice, in a brief role as a comedic tool. Both found ways to embed cultural references across a wide range of American history and popular culture that rewarded viewers who recognized the references. The differences are real and substantial, but so is the common ground. Number, Supplemental Section G. Forgotten episodes, underrated moments, and the show's best-kept secrets. Among Family Guy's more than 400 episodes, there is a substantial tier of material that does not get discussed in the same breath as the most famous episodes or the most controversial ones. These are episodes that demonstrated something specific about the show's capabilities without becoming cultural touchstones, that told a particular kind of story that the show was capable of telling but did not return to often enough. Understanding these episodes is part of understanding what Family Guy actually was across its full run. The Season 8 episode Brian and Stewie is one of the most formally unusual episodes in the show's entire catalog. It takes place in real time, within a single setting, a bank vault where Brian and Stewie are accidentally locked over a holiday weekend, and unfolds entirely as a two-character conversation. There are no cutaway gags, there are no other characters, there is no main story beyond the conversation itself. Brian reveals that he keeps a firearm in his safety deposit box at the bank because there are moments when he contemplates using it on himself. Stewie reveals, in ways that are both comic and genuinely affecting, how much Brian means to him. The episode functions as proof that Family Guy could produce dramatic, character-driven content of real quality when it committed to doing so without the usual structural crutches. The Road to Germany episode is less celebrated than most Road to installments, but contains one of the show's more genuinely bold plot decisions. Stewie travels back in time to World War II Europe to help a friend, and the episode spends significant time in Nazi-occupied territory. The show handles this with more directness than you might expect. The Nazis are depicted as genuinely terrifying rather than cartoonishly villainous, and the stakes of the historical situation are taken seriously within the episode's comic framework. It is not a comfortable episode, and the discomfort is intentional. The PTV episode is better remembered for the FCC song than for its overall construction, but the episode as a whole is one of the tighter half hours of network satire the show produced. Peter's television network, operating without FCC oversight, produces content of escalating grossness, while the FCC simultaneously overcorrects by beginning to censor things in the real world. The episode's satirical logic is cleaner than most of what the show does with political and regulatory topics, and it moves through its plot without losing the thread. The episode Petarded, in which Peter discovers he qualifies as mentally impaired based on standardized testing, and uses that status to avoid consequences, is remembered as an uncomfortable episode by some viewers, but it contains some of the most interesting character writing for Peter in the show's middle period. The episode forces the show to examine what Peter's impaired cognition means for how we understand his behavior, and while it does not fully commit to the implications, the attempt to grapple with them produces moments of genuine complexity. The Simpsons crossover contains a specific background visual that the show placed without calling attention to it. During a scene in Springfield, several of the show's ongoing background characters appear in the background as citizens of Springfield, dressed in slightly different style to fit the Simpsons' visual register. Finding these characters requires careful attention, and the placement of them was the show's way of rewarding viewers who were paying close enough attention to notice. Among the rarest facts in Family Guy's history is the detail that Family Guy was supposed to be a series of MAD-TV interstitials before it became a full series, a fact that MacFarlane confirmed publicly, but that tends to get lost. In the more dramatic story of the Fox pitch and the Super Bowl premiere, had the Mad TV version happened, Family Guy would have existed as short-form content embedded in a sketch comedy program, which is almost certainly a format in which it would not have found the audience or the space to develop into what it became. The budget limitation that made the Mad TV version impossible was, in retrospect, one of the luckiest creative constraints in the show's history. The show's relationship with the Emmy Awards is a story that goes beyond the Outstanding Comedy Series nomination. Family Guy has won individual Emmy Awards across the years for voice acting, writing, and other specific categories. Seth MacFarlane won the Outstanding Voiceover Performance Emmy in 2000 in the show's very first year for his work as Stewie. This award arrived before most critics had decided the show was worth taking seriously, which gives it a particular kind of historical significance. The voice performance that would eventually become the subject of extensive discussion about how much the character had changed from its original conception was recognized as exceptional in its original form before anyone had reason to be nostalgic about it. The show maintains an internal style guide not just for visual consistency but for character voice consistency as well. New writers joining the show are given documents that describe each character's speech patterns, vocabulary, typical reference points, and the specific kinds of jokes that each character would and would not make. These documents are updated periodically as characters evolve, but they represent an attempt to maintain something like continuity in characterization even as the specific people doing the writing change. The Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, where Peter has worked for most of the show's run, is based loosely on actual New England brewing culture, which the show's Rhode Island setting made a natural reference point. The Pawtucket Patriot Ale itself is a fictional brand that has become one of the show's most recognizable fictional products, appearing in merchandise and achieving a kind of secondary existence as a recognizable element of the show's brand that exists independently of any specific episode. Number Supplemental Section H. The Internet, the Clips, and How Family Guy Changed Comedy Distribution. One of Family Guy's less discussed legacies is its role in shaping how comedy gets distributed and consumed in the internet era. The show was in a uniquely positioned moment when YouTube launched in 2005, the same year. Family Guy returned from cancellation, and the specific format of the cutaway gag made Family Guy content peculiarly suited to the way that early YouTube users consumed and shared video. A 30-second cutaway gag is a perfect internet video. It has a clear beginning and end. It does not require context from the surrounding episode to be funny. It can be understood and appreciated by someone who has never seen Family Guy and has no investment in the characters. It can be watched in the middle of something else, shared quickly, and forgotten without any narrative commitment required. The architecture of Family Guy's comedy was, essentially accidentally, optimized for an internet distribution model that did not exist when the show was originally designed. The result was that as YouTube grew and the norms of online video sharing developed, Family Guy clips became among the most widely circulated comedy content available. The show generated a secondary internet audience that was larger and differently constituted than its broadcast audience. People who had never sat down and watched a complete episode of Family Guy from beginning to end had still seen dozens of individual cutaway gags through social sharing. This created a cultural presence for the show that its broadcast ratings in any given season did not fully capture. This dynamic had a feedback effect on the show itself. If the most shareable and most widely seen parts of the show were the cutaway gags, then producing more and better cutaway gags was a rational, creative, and economic response to the media environment. The show's increasing reliance on cutaways across its middle and later seasons can be read partly as a creative failure and partly as a rational adaptation to a media landscape where individual viral moments mattered more than sustained narrative quality. The clips culture around Family Guy also contributed to a specific kind of reputation problem. Because the most widely shared clips were often the show's most outrageous or most offensive moments, the scenes that provoked strong reactions, the gags that crossed lines, the public image of Family Guy came to be defined by its worst impulses as often as by its best work. A casual observer whose only exposure to Family Guy came through internet clips might know the show primarily as a vehicle for offensive humor without the tonal context that surrounds those moments in complete episodes. Family Guy was among the first broadcast television shows to have a significant relationship with streaming. Before streaming was the dominant distribution model. Hulu, which launched in 2007 and began building a library of licensed television content, acquired the streaming rights to Family Guy and has maintained them as one of its marquee animated titles. The availability of the full back catalog on Hulu has been one of the factors that has kept the show's cultural presence alive during seasons when its broadcast ratings have declined significantly. The show's content on TikTok and Instagram Reels, both platforms that did not exist during most of Family Guy's run, represents the newest layer of this distribution ecosystem. Clips from episodes that are 15 or 20 years old continue to circulate on these platforms, introducing the show to viewers who were children or not yet born when those episodes originally aired. This ongoing circulation of archival content is one of the reasons that Family Guy's brand recognition remains high, even as its broadcast audience has shrunk substantially. The Conway Twitty gag, discussed in an earlier section, became particularly notorious in this context. Clips of Conway Twitty performances being used as Family Guy punchlines circulated widely as examples of either brilliant anti-comedy or pure laziness, depending on the viewer's perspective. The gag was designed for a broadcast audience that had no choice but to sit through the full performance or change the channel. In an internet context, where the clip ends and can be reshared immediately, the gag takes on a different quality. It becomes a performance of commitment to an absurd premise, rather than an imposition on a captive audience. The show's theme song has had its own internet life. The opening sequence, with its Broadway-style production number and its jazzy orchestration, has been covered, remixed, and referenced across numerous platforms and contexts. Seth Green has performed it, fan orchestras have recorded it, it has been played at sporting events and used in advertising contexts. The specific musical identity that MacFarlane fought to maintain against network pressure to shorten or simplify it has proven to be one of the show's most durable cultural artifacts. There is something worth noting about what all of this internet distribution has done to the relationship between the show's creative quality and its cultural relevance. In previous eras of television, a show's quality and its cultural presence were more closely correlated. Shows that were good got watched and talked about. Shows that declined in quality lost their audience and their cultural relevance together. Family Guy, partly because of internet distribution and partly because of its specific format's compatibility with clip culture, has maintained a high level of cultural presence through periods where critical consensus about the show's quality has been more mixed. The clips keep circulating whether or not the current season is producing material that warrants the attention. That is a genuinely new phenomenon in the history of television, and Family Guy is one of its clearest examples. If you are still with me, thank you for the company. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching this from and what time it is there. I am always amazed by the places these videos reach. If this helped you see Family Guy in a way you had not before, hit subscribe and share it with someone who loves the show as much as you do. There is more to explore, and I will see you in the next one. Number, supplemental section. The Peter Griffin voice. One man's unusual journey to an iconic sound. The voice of Peter Griffin is one of the most recognizable sounds in American television comedy, and the story of how Seth MacFarlane developed and refined it across more than 25 years is worth examining in considerably more detail than it usually receives. It is a story about specificity, about the way a voice actor builds a character from a handful of real-world observations, and about how the demands of a long-running role gradually transform both the performance and the performer's understanding of it. MacFarlane has been consistent in crediting the RISD security guard as the primary inspiration for Peter's vocal quality. But what he has said less often is that the voice evolved significantly between The Life of Larry, where it was slightly more generic, and the final broadcast version that settled into its recognizable form. The pilot for Fox, the 15-minute presentation that got the show greenlit, contained a version of Peter's voice that was broader and slightly less specific than what you hear in the broadcast episodes. MacFarlane continued to refine the accent and the cadence during production of the first season, and the version of the voice in the later first-season episodes is considerably more precise than the version in the pilot. The specific quality that MacFarlane pursues with Peter is what he has described as a cheerful obliviousness, a vocal register that conveys absolute confidence about things that do not warrant confidence, and absolute incomprehension about things that any adult should understand. The voice never sounds stupid in its own estimation. Peter always sounds like someone who is certain that what he is saying makes complete sense. That self-assurance in a voice that is demonstrably saying things that make no sense is one of the primary sources of Peter's comedic effect. MacFarlane has also spoken about the physical demands of sustaining Peter's voice across recording sessions. The voice is pitched at a specific register that is not MacFarlane's natural speaking voice, and holding that register for hours of recording across dozens of lines of dialogue, across the variety of emotional states that Peter moves through in any given episode, requires genuine vocal discipline. Voice actors rarely receive the same recognition for physical endurance as stage or screen performers. But the sustained delivery of a non-natural vocal instrument across decades of production represents a real form of athletic commitment. The relationship between MacFarlane's Peter voice and his own natural speaking voice is an interesting one to examine. MacFarlane speaks in a mid-Atlantic, educated American accent, the accent of someone who grew up in New England and went to an art school, someone who has spent a career in Los Angeles without entirely losing his regional origins. The gap between that natural voice and Peter's thick Rhode Island working-class accent is significant, and bridging it requires a consistent investment of technique that MacFarlane has been sustaining for more than a quarter-century. In scenes where Peter is singing rather than speaking, the voice shifts in ways that reveal the technique behind it. Peter's singing voice is intentionally rough and imprecise. The voice of someone who thinks he can sing and is completely wrong about this. But the roughness is controlled roughness. It has a specific character. MacFarlane, who is a genuine and skilled singer in his personal musical career, is performing deliberate imprecision in a way that requires considerable skill to sustain convincingly. The joke only works if Peter's singing sounds authentically bad in a specific way. Random badness would not land the same way. The badness has to be Peter's badness, which is a different thing. Number Supplemental Section J. Things the show predicted, and the dark truth about that Boston Marathon episode. Family Guy has a specific and slightly uncomfortable relationship with prediction. The show has, across its long run, produced material that anticipated real events in ways that range from coincidental to genuinely unsettling. This is partly a natural consequence of a show that has been producing content about a wide range of contemporary topics for more than 25 years. The law of large numbers ensures that some of what the show imagines will eventually approximate reality, but some specific cases are worth examining directly. The Boston Marathon episode situation is the most discussed example. The Season 11 episode Turban Cowboy, which aired in March of 2013, contained scenes involving Peter accidentally becoming associated with terrorists and subsequently being involved in an explosion at a marathon. The Boston Marathon bombing occurred the following month, in April of 2013. The proximity and subject matter was genuinely disturbing, and Fox and Hulu both removed the episode from circulation temporarily out of sensitivity to people who had been directly affected by the real event. What made this situation additionally complicated was the circulation, on social media, of what appeared to be a clip that showed Family Guy having specifically predicted the bombing in detail. That clip was fabricated. It was created by someone who edited together unrelated clips from the episode to make them appear to show specific events they did not actually show. The fabricated clip spread widely before fact-checkers identified it as fake, which demonstrates something important about the relationship between animated content and misinformation. Because the show's visual language is stylized and relatively simple, it is easier to create convincing-seeming fake versions of its content than it would be for live-action programming. The Turban Cowboy episode itself, as opposed to the fabricated version of it, did not specifically predict the Boston Marathon bombing. It involved a marathon, and it involved an explosion in separate scenes that were not in the relationship the fabricated clip suggested. But the show's removal of the episode acknowledged that the proximity was uncomfortable, regardless of whether the relationship was what social media claimed. Beyond that specific case, Family Guy's record on prediction is mostly a demonstration of how a show that aggressively engages with contemporary culture, technology, and social change will occasionally find itself in the same territory as real events. The show's take on social media in the mid-2000s anticipated specific behaviors that became common several years later. Its engagement with political figures and political scandals across its run has occasionally produced moments where the satirical treatment of a hypothetical situation was later followed by something resembling that situation in reality. These are not evidence of supernatural foresight. They are evidence of a writing room that paid close attention to trends and patterns in American life. Number Supplemental Section K. The show's relationship with religion, a history of provocations. Family Guy's treatment of religion is one of the most consistently discussed aspects of its content, and one of the areas where the gap between the show's intent and its reception has been most clearly visible. The show has depicted God, Jesus, Satan, and representatives of virtually every major religious tradition in ways that range from satirical to irreverent to genuinely provocative, and the reaction to these depictions has been proportionally varied. The show's God character appears periodically, typically depicted as a somewhat vain, somewhat petty supernatural figure who has human-scale insecurities and does not always behave in ways consistent with omniscience or benevolence. This depiction is entirely in the tradition of comedic treatments of the divine that stretch back centuries through literature, theater, and art, and MacFarlane has consistently defended it on those grounds. The joke is not that God does not exist. The joke is that if God existed and had the personality that certain religious traditions ascribe to him, the results would be darkly comedic. The Season 6 episode, Not All Dogs Go to Heaven, which depicted the town of Quahog becoming populated by closed-minded religious fundamentalists after a Star Trek convention made Meg a born-again Christian, generated significant criticism from religious organizations. The Parents Television Council objected strenuously. The episode also featured Brian explicitly identifying as an atheist and arguing for a secular worldview, which was the show most directly using a character to advocate a specific position on religious belief, rather than satirizing all sides more evenly. MacFarlane is publicly and consistently an atheist, and that personal position has occasionally been more visible in the show than its satirical stance might ideally warrant. The episodes that work best as religious satire are the ones where the show mocks the human behavior associated with religion, the tribalism, the self-righteousness, the gap between stated values and actual conduct, rather than the ones where specific theological positions are advanced through character dialogue. The former is comedy. The latter tends to feel more like debate. The show's depictions of Jesus, who appears periodically as a recurring character who has returned to Earth and is trying to navigate modern life with uncertain success, are among the more consistently successful religious comedy bits in the show's catalog. The Jesus character works because the humor comes from situational fish-out-of-water comedy rather than from theological argument. Jesus navigating social media, Jesus dealing with the gap between how he is depicted in religious art and how he actually looks, Jesus being recognized in uncomfortable social situations, these are forms of comedy that do not require the show to take a position on whether Jesus is divine. They simply require accepting that the character exists in the show's world and that the situations he encounters are funny. Number. Supplemental Section L. The show's complete awards history and what it reveals. Family Guy's awards history tells a story that does not get told often enough, because it involves a trajectory that goes from genuine critical recognition to a kind of awards-adjacent irrelevance that reflects the broader critical consensus about the show's later seasons. The show's Emmy wins include Outstanding Voiceover Performance for MacFarlane's work as Stewie in 2000, the very first year of the show's existence. This was recognition given quickly and in the show's creative prime, which lends it a specific weight. The award was not for the accumulated work of a long career or for a particularly memorable single performance. It was for the overall vocal achievement of creating and sustaining a character whose complexity and humor were apparent to the Academy's voters from the earliest episodes. The Outstanding Comedy Series nomination in 2009 was the historic one. No animated series had been nominated in that category since The Flintstones in 1961, a span of 48 years. The Family Guy nomination broke that streak and placed the show in company with the best live-action comedies of its era, including 30 Rock and The Office, both of which were considered among the most sophisticated comedies on television at the time. Family Guy did not win the award, but the nomination itself was a statement about the scope of what the show had achieved. The Annie Awards, the animation industry's equivalent of the Oscars, have recognized the show periodically across its run. The show's theme song was nominated for Outstanding Individual Achievement for Music in a Television Production in 2000. Voice performances, writing, and animation have received Annie recognition in subsequent years. These awards represent the animation industry's internal recognition of craft, and the show's Annie history is more consistent than its Emmy history, which reflects the animation community's understanding of the technical achievement involved in what Family Guy does. The show also has a negative awards history that is worth acknowledging. The Parents Television Council's worst show designations in 2000, 2005, and 2006 represent a kind of anti-recognition that the show has consistently treated as a badge of honor rather than as cause for concern. MacFarlane's response to PTC criticism over the years has been characteristically direct. The show is made for adults, it airs at a time that children are not supposed to be watching unsupervised, and the existence of people who object to its content does not constitute a case for altering that content. This position has been consistent and has not changed across the show's run. The show's recognition by TV Guide ranked among the 9 greatest television cartoons of all time, placed it in company with The Simpsons, Looney Tunes, and other historically significant animated works. That recognition came in 2013, which was past the point where most critical consensus had decided the show had begun a sustained decline in quality. The ranking reflected the show's aggregate historical achievement rather than its current creative state, which is both a generous interpretation and probably the correct one. Emmy recognition for the show's music has come periodically, including for the My Drunken Irish Dad song that was nominated in 2007. This consistent acknowledgement of the show's musical achievement, in contexts where its overall creative quality was receiving more mixed reviews, is itself a fact about the show that, whatever else was happening creatively, the musical dimension of the program maintained a standard that award voters considered worth recognizing. Number. Supplemental Section M. The show's relationship with its own history, self-reference as comedy and as coping mechanism. Among the more interesting creative choices Family Guy has made across its long run is its increasing willingness to reference its own history, to joke about its own declining reputation, and to use self-awareness as a substitute for the kind of genuine creative renewal that would have addressed the underlying issues that the self-awareness was acknowledging. This is a specific pattern that becomes visible around season 8 or 9 and intensifies in subsequent years. Characters begin making jokes about the show's cutaway dependency. Peter makes direct references to the fact that the show has been running too long. Fourth wall breaks that acknowledge the show's declining quality become a recurring comic device. The writer's room's awareness of the criticism being leveled at the show found its way into the scripts, and the scripts turned that awareness into jokes. This approach is genuinely funny some of the time. Acknowledging the criticisms of your work within the work itself requires a kind of confidence and self-possession that can read as charming, but it also creates a situation where the show is essentially arguing that it is aware of its problems, which is different from actually fixing those problems. A show that jokes about its cutaways while continuing to lean on cutaways is in a paradoxical creative position, using the same mechanism it is critiquing to demonstrate that it is critiquing the mechanism. The Back to the Pilot episode is the best example of this tendency working in the show's favor. The episode's structure, having Brian and Stewie literally visit the first episode of the show and observe it from the outside, gave the writers an opportunity to examine what the show used to be while placing that examination within the show's current aesthetic register. The joke about characters standing awkwardly during cutaways, waiting for the gag to end so they can continue the scene, was one of the most self-aware moments in the show's history, and it worked precisely because it was embedded in an episode that was doing something structurally interesting rather than simply acknowledging a problem while continuing to demonstrate it. The show's 100th episode, and its 200th episode, and its 300th and 400th episodes each received special treatment that included retrospective elements and meta-commentary on the show's history. These milestone episodes are a broadcasting tradition. Most long-running shows produce them, and they give writers a sanctioned opportunity to indulge in the kind of self-reference that might feel self-indulgent. In a standard episode, Family Guy's milestone episodes have generally handled this license with enough humor and enough genuine affection for the material to make the self-congratulation palatable. The show's relationship with its own mythology, the accumulated facts, relationships, and history of the characters as established across hundreds of episodes is something that writers have handled inconsistently, but with occasional moments of genuine skill. Episodes that call back to events from many seasons earlier, that reference character details established in the show's earliest seasons, that treat the show's own continuity as a resource to be mined, give longtime viewers a specific kind of reward that the show has always been capable of providing and has not always remembered to pursue. The ultimately unresolvable tension in the show's self-awareness is this: recognizing that something is wrong is not the same thing as fixing it, and a show that has developed the habit of acknowledging its own flaws within its own text is not thereby absolved of those flaws. The fourth wall breaks that reference the show's declining quality are, in a sense, the most honest thing the show does in its later seasons. But honesty about a problem without addressing the problem is a limited form of progress. The show knows this. The audience knows this, and the show knows that the audience knows this, which produces additional self-aware jokes that acknowledge all of these things in an expanding spiral of meta-commentary that is both impressively self-conscious and ultimately not as satisfying as actually being the thing the show used to be. That is the final, honest fact about Family Guy. It is fully aware of its own complicated legacy, and it keeps making jokes about that awareness, and those jokes are sometimes genuinely funny, and they are never quite enough. Thank you for spending this time with me going through the full, complicated, genuinely fascinating history of one of the strangest and most resilient animated shows American television has ever produced. If you want more of this, more deep dives, more detailed histories, more of the facts that sit underneath what most people know, hit subscribe and you will never miss what comes next. I read every comment, I respond to as many as I can, and I will see you in the next one. Number. Supplemental Section N. The spin-offs, the expanded universe, and what they reveal about the original. Family Guy's legacy is not contained within Family Guy itself. The show generated an extended creative ecosystem spin-off series, direct-to-video films, video games, crossover events, and the announced new Stewie-focused project, and examining that ecosystem tells you things about the original that watching the original alone does not reveal. The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013 on Fox, is the case study in how difficult it is to sustain the elements that made a parent show work when you transplant its secondary characters into a new context. Cleveland Brown had been a reliable supporting presence in Family Guy for 10 seasons. Funny in specific situations, defined by his patience, his deep voice, and his general good nature, but not a character who had ever needed to carry a full narrative on his own. The Cleveland Show gave him that responsibility and discovered that his supporting character traits, the patience, the reasonableness, the genial quality were more difficult to sustain as primary character traits than as counterweights to Peter's chaos. The Cleveland Show was not a bad television program in any absolute sense. It produced some genuinely funny episodes and built a supporting cast that had its own personality. But it never found an identity that was fully distinct from Family Guy's identity, and it struggled throughout its run with the comparison to both its parent show and to American Dad, which had made the transition from MacFarlane's second show to something that felt fully independent in a way the Cleveland Show never managed. When the show was canceled after its fourth season, Cleveland returned to Family Guy, which accepted him back without much acknowledgement of where he had been. American Dad's contrast with the Cleveland Show is instructive. American Dad managed what the Cleveland Show could not. It developed an identity so distinct from Family Guy's that the comparison stopped being the primary way audiences understood it. The Stan Smith character is superficially similar to Peter Griffin, a limited, overconfident man whose worldview is consistently at odds with reality, but the specific form of that limitation is different in ways that matter. Stan's limitations are ideological rather than simply cognitive. He is not stupid in Peter's way. He has a complete and internally consistent worldview that happens to be wrong about almost everything that matters. Working against that specific kind of wrong-headedness produced a different kind of comedy than working against Peter's oblivious stupidity. Roger the Alien became, over American Dad's run, something that the show developed without a real equivalent in Family Guy. The persona-adopting character, someone who exists primarily as a vessel for different characters, different personalities, different backstories, gave American Dad's writers an almost unlimited creative resource. Every episode could feature a completely new version of Roger, which prevented the kind of character repetition that haunted Family Guy's later seasons. The contrast between how American Dad managed its secondary characters and how Family Guy managed its secondary characters explains a significant part of the quality gap between the two shows in their later seasons. The direct-to-video film Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, served a specific function in the Family Guy universe that is sometimes overlooked. Released in 2005 as the show was returning from its 3-year cancellation, the film was constructed from 3 extended episodes that had been produced for the 4th season. The assembly of these episodes into a film format, with additional footage that could not have aired on broadcast television, gave the production team a commercial product that sat between television and film in terms of format and content. The film's plot, which involved Stewie discovering what appeared to be his future self and grappling with questions about identity and destiny, was also one of the earliest extended explorations of Stewie as a character, outside the constraints of the weekly episode format. The announced Stewie project, scheduled for 2027 or 2028, represents the most ambitious step yet in the Family Guy extended universe. A project built entirely around Stewie Griffin, without the surrounding family, without the weekly episode format, in whatever form the project takes would require the writers and producers to answer questions about the character that the main show has never had to answer definitively. What does Stewie want? Outside of the abandoned world domination plots? What does his relationship with Brian mean without the Griffin family as context? Who is this character when he is not being defined in relation to the people around him? These are interesting creative questions, and the fact that the franchise has a character compelling enough to sustain them is itself evidence of how well the original show built its central personalities. Whatever happened to Stewie across 20-plus seasons of evolution and deviation, he remains someone audiences are interested in spending time with. That interest survived the changes to his characterization. That is a testament to the original conception. The Family Guy video game catalog represents another dimension of the franchise's extended universe. Games including Family Guy, Back to the Multiverse, which used the show's established alternate universe episode as a setting for a third-person shooter game, and Family Guy, The Quest for Stuff, the mobile resource management game, gave the show's world an interactive dimension. The Quest for Stuff has been particularly successful in the mobile gaming space, allowing players to rebuild the fictional town after a disaster destroys it, a premise that essentially mirrors the show's own narrative pattern of destruction and reset, and has maintained an active player base for years. The show's presence in theme parks is a less discussed dimension of its reach. Universal Studios theme parks have incorporated Family Guy content into their attractions at various points, bringing the show's characters into a physical space where audiences can encounter them in 3 dimensions. This kind of theme park integration is available only to properties with sufficient name recognition and commercial value to justify the capital investment, which places Family Guy in a tier of franchise properties that most television comedies never reach. The merchandise ecosystem around Family Guy is extensive enough to constitute its own industry. Clothing, toys, collectibles, phone cases, home goods, gaming accessories, and countless other categories bear the show's characters. Peter Griffin's face appears on items sold in contexts that have nothing to do with the show's themes or humor. The characters have been abstracted into commercial icons whose presence sells things by simple brand recognition. This is the fully realized commercial form of a cultural penetration that started with people quoting lines to each other in the early 2000s and has now extended to the Griffin family's likeness, appearing on products in countries where the show may not even air. The international reach of Family Guy is something that most American audiences have no reason to think about, but that shapes the show's commercial viability significantly. The show is dubbed in multiple languages and airs in numerous international markets. The translation of its specific kind of humor, heavily dependent on American cultural references, on regional dialect, on a very particular sense of what is offensive and why presents enormous challenges for localization teams. The jokes that depend on knowledge of specific American television shows, political figures, regional stereotypes, or pop culture moments from the 1970s and 1980s simply cannot be translated directly. Local voice actors and translation teams have developed strategies for finding functional equivalents in each market, which means that Family Guy in Germany or Family Guy in Japan is a partially different comedy experience from Family Guy in the United States, built on the same foundation but adapted to produce similar emotional effects through locally appropriate material. The show's longevity has given it the unusual distinction of being simultaneously a currently airing program and a historical artifact. There are viewers who grew up watching Family Guy in its original run, who now watch it with their own children who encounter the show's earlier seasons as historical comedy rather than as current television. This generational layering of the audience creates a situation where the show means different things to different viewers, depending entirely on when they first encountered it and what their life looked like at that point. A viewer who watched Road to Rhode Island when it first aired in 2000 has a relationship with that episode that is categorically different from the relationship a 20-year-old viewer watching it for the first time on Hulu in the present has. Both relationships are real. Both constitute genuine connections to the material. They simply are not the same connection. This is what 25 years of a creative work produces, a multiplicity of audiences, each with their own version of the show, each carrying a different part of what Family Guy has been across its long and complicated existence. The young person who fell in love with Evil Stewie in 1999. The college student who discovered the show on Adult Swim at 2 in the morning in 2003 and bought the DVD the next week. The family that watches current episodes together in 2026, without necessarily knowing what the show used to be, they are all watching Family Guy. They are not all watching the same thing. That multiplicity is perhaps the final and most important fact about the show. Family Guy is not one thing. It never was. It was a thesis film and a network pitch and a cult following and a cultural phenomenon and a declining ratings franchise and a streaming staple and a multi-generational brand and a creative experiment and a commercial product and an expression of one young man's very specific artistic vision and a committee production that has outlasted the original vision in both duration and output. All of those things are simultaneously true. All of them are Family Guy. And that is why, more than 25 years after a 22 million person audience watched the first episode together on a January night in 1999, people are still watching, still talking, and still finding things they did not know they did not know. That is everything, at least for today. There is always more to find in a show that has been running this long and that has this many layers. If you learned something new, if something surprised you, if you walked away from this feeling like you understood Family Guy in a way you did not before, tell me about it in the comments. I would genuinely love to know. Hit subscribe if you want more of this kind of storytelling. And wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is where you are sitting right now, thank you for being here. Number, a final thought. On watching something for a very long time, there is a specific experience that comes from following a creative work across a significant portion of your life. You do not just watch it change, you watch yourself change around it. The episodes that hit differently now than they did when you first saw them, not because the episodes changed, but because you have changed. Because you carry different things into the room when you sit down with them. The jokes that seemed purely funny once carry a different weight when you are older and have lived closer to the things they are joking about. Family Guy is a show that has given an enormous number of people exactly this experience, across a very long time. A generation of viewers has grown up with this show, aged through it, watched it age alongside them, argued about it, defended it, criticized it, quoted it in contexts where quoting it embarrassed them, and kept watching it anyway. That relationship, messy, complicated, inconsistent, occasionally infuriating, periodically transcendent, is not so different from the show's portrayal of the Griffin family itself. You stick with them because the alternative is worse than the frustration. The show earned that loyalty in its best seasons. It has spent subsequent years trading on that loyalty. Whether the ledger is net positive or net negative depends on who you ask and on which specific episodes formed your connection to the show in the first place. But the loyalty persists, which is its own kind of testament to what the show built in the years when it was building something worth being loyal to. Family Guy began as one person's vision. It became something much larger than any one person's vision can contain. That is the arc of every successful creative work, and it is neither tragedy nor triumph. It is simply what happens when something you make becomes something that belongs to everyone who encounters it. Seth MacFarlane made something. The audience took it. 25 years later, both of those facts remain simultaneously true, and neither one cancels out the other. Take care of yourselves. See you in the next one.